Hey everyone. Tonight we step quietly into the marble halls of ancient Rome, a world where gold shimmered under torchlight, where emperors dined like gods, and where every sip of wine could be their last. It's a story not of battles or conquests, but of dinners, long, glittering, and quietly fatal. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. It's always a strange comfort to know that while one person listens in the soft hours before sleep, another might be beginning their morning somewhere across the world. Now, turn down the lights. Maybe put your phone on silent, let the day fade out slowly, and imagine this. The year is somewhere between marble and decay, the empire at its height, its power absolute, its rulers untouchable. Yet beneath the gold and the glory, something invisible lingers in the air, a taste of fear, a scent of bitterness in the cup, and the quiet knowledge that at Rome's grandest tables, the greatest danger was not the enemy beyond the walls, but the meal placed right before the emperor. So, get comfortable, breathe slow, and let's drift together into the story of why Roman emperors died in poisoned banquets. There are moments in history when a civilization appears almost motionless, so vast and certain in its own permanence, that time seems to hesitate before moving forward. Rome, in the first century of its empire, stood precisely at that still point. From the marble terraces of the Palatine Hill, the city stretched outward in slow undulation, its roofs and columns washed in the deep amber of evening. The last smoke from public baths drifted into the air, curling above tiled domes that had seen the triumphs of Augustus and the careful order of Tiberius. To below, the streets whispered with the muted rhythm of sandals, the rattle of carts, and the occasional bark of a dog left to wander between taverns. Inside the palaces, light burned gently through sheets of mica set into the walls. The corridors smelled faintly of olive oil and wax. Bronze lamps hung from chains, trembling slightly in the night air, their flames bowing to each passing servant. The empire had grown too large for urgency. Its frontiers touched deserts, seas, and forests where no Latin words were spoken. Taxes arrived late, messages later, and yet the city still believed itself eternal. That belief, more than legions or laws, held it together, though it carried within it the quiet exhaustion of power. At the heart of this expanse sat the emperor's household, a labyrinth of marble and shadow. Every surface glimmered, walls of porphyry imported from Egypt, statues carved in Greece, tables inlaid with African ivory. Yet within the cool perfection of these rooms, there was a curious silence, as if the air itself respected the gravity of authority. To the emperor's presence had become more than human. It was ceremonial, almost divine. To dine with him was not an act of appetite, but of worship. The banquet was a daily ritual of loyalty, hierarchy, and unseen fear. Feasts had long defined Rome. During the Republic, senators had gathered for modest dinners, their pride measured by restraint. But with the empire came abundance that bordered on delirium. Ships from Alexandria brought glassy fish and fine wines. From Hispania came jars of garum, the fermented sauce that flavored nearly everything. From the provinces arrived honey, pepper, dates, and figs, dried in the sun of Africa. The empire's borders fed its center like tributaries converging upon a lake that grew deeper each year. To eat in Rome was to taste the conquest of the world, but indulgence carried a cost, not of money, for there was always more to plunder or tax, but of trust. Food that traveled such distance came not only through the hands of traders and cooks, but through those of ambition and resentment. In a palace where even whispers could be treason, every platter became a vessel of possibility. A dish might carry flavor, or it might carry death. The emperor's table was a mirror of the empire itself, wide, ornate, and fragile beneath its polish. Around it reclined senators and generals, poets and patrons, each pretending ease while calculating glances. Slaves moved silently among them, pouring wine from amphorae stamped with imperial seals. The room smelled of cinnamon, myrrh, and roasted meats. Faint notes of perfume rose from bowls of burning resin placed at the corners. Conversation drifted like smoke, cautious, measured, and faintly rehearsed. Somewhere in the shadows, tasters stood ready, their task both honorable and perilous. Before each course was served, they lifted a morsel to their lips, waiting a heartbeat before nodding that it was safe. It was a small ritual of reassurance that fooled no one. In Rome, poison was less a substance than a rumor, and rumors were often more fatal. Even emperors who appeared serene, Augustus for instance, were aware of how slender the thread of survival could be. Augustus had risen through careful patience, and though he cultivated the image of a fatherly ruler, his reign was secured by a network of informers and quiet eliminations. The empire at dusk glowed with civility, but beneath the lamplight there lay the remains of conspiracies buried in silence. The architecture of power demanded constant performance. At every banquet, the emperor's presence reminded guests of divine order, Jupiter at the head of the mortal world, yet within that same ceremony lurked a tension no marble could disguise. The Roman elite understood that proximity to greatness was as dangerous as exile from it. One could not refuse an invitation to dine with the emperor, yet one could never entirely trust the meal placed before him. As night settled across the Tiber, the palace grew quieter. In the distance the amphitheatre slept, its sand still darkened by the day's spectacle. Beyond the walls, the poor of the Subura district huddled around small fires, roasting scraps of bread and dreaming of the next grain dole. The empire was unified by hunger, though expressed differently, the hunger of the masses for bread and of the rulers for permanence. Both in their way could never be satisfied. Through the colonnades, statues of long-dead ancestors seemed to watch the proceedings. They had witnessed generations of triumphs and betrayals, each emperor convinced his reign would last. Each banquet served as if eternity could be swallowed one course at a time. In this stillness, history began to turn imperceptibly, not with revolt or invasion, but with fatigue. Empires seldom fall from blows. They fade first from within, when luxury dulls vigilance and ceremony replaces meaning. The empire at dusk was beautiful in the way old things are beautiful. Luminous, poised, but edged with decay. The marble floors shone, yet tiny cracks had begun to appear where the stones met. The servants knew these fissures. They knelt each morning to polish around them, pretending not to see. Perhaps the emperors did the same. They too polished the surface of their rule, ignoring the fine lines of suspicion forming beneath. And so the banquets continued, endless, glittering, hypnotic, each one an act of reassurance that the world remained orderly, that Rome was eternal, that the emperor's life was beyond reach. Yet even as musicians played their soft notes and candles flickered against the walls, a quiet truth lingered in Rome. Power was eaten as much as it was wielded, and every taste of pleasure carried the faint memory of poison. It was here, in this delicate balance between splendor and fear, that the next chapter of the story began, the one where the banquet itself became a weapon, and where the most dangerous seat in all the world was the one nearest the emperor's. The transformation of dining into ritual did not happen suddenly. It was the quiet evolution of centuries, from the rough meals of early farmers to the elaborate performances that came to define Rome at its height. The banquet, in its mature form, was no longer merely about food or even pleasure. It was a microcosm of the empire itself, arranged with precision, hierarchy, and reverence. To understand how an emperor could die in his own dining room, one must first understand what it meant to dine as a Roman. The evening meal, known as the cena, began when the city was wrapped in the gold of late afternoon. Slaves moved like shadows through the corridors, lighting oil lamps and preparing basins of warm water scented with rose petals. Guests entered the triclinium, the formal dining room, through bronze doors, greeted not by words but by gesture and fragrance. The air was thick with incense, myrtle, and the faint mineral scent of polished marble. The triclinium itself was carefully arranged. 3 couches, each set around a low rectangular table, forming a horseshoe shape. Upon these couches, diners reclined on their left sides, propped by cushions, leaving their right hands free for eating. Reclining to eat was more than comfort. It was privilege. To recline meant you were free, part of the elite. Slaves, women in many eras, and the poor ate sitting or standing, often from wooden bowls or coarse pottery. The position of one's couch within the triclinium also mattered. The central couch, the lectus medius, was the place of honor, and the seat closest to the host, the locus consularis, signified the highest esteem. To be invited there was a mark of imperial favor. To be omitted was an insult that could echo far beyond the meal itself. The meal began with the gestatio, the appetizer course, olives, eggs, shellfish, sometimes dressed with honey or vinegar. Wine mixed with water was poured into silver cups, the ratio of dilution depending on the host's taste and the occasion. Roman wine, strong and unrefined by modern standards, was rarely drunk pure. The water was often cooled with snow brought from mountain cellars, another sign of wealth and reach. Between courses, slaves washed guests' hands with warm water, poured from small ewers, the droplets glinting under lamplight like jewels. As the meal continued, the food became a kind of theatre. Dishes arrived not merely to be eaten but to be admired. Peacocks roasted with their feathers, reattached. Dormice rolled in honey and poppy seeds. Fish dyed blue with wine. Flamingo tongues said to please the palate of emperors. Each dish was a declaration of abundance, of control over the natural world. Recipes from Apicius, a Roman collection of cookery, reveal an obsession with balance and showmanship. Sweet against sour, soft against crisp. The transformation of the ordinary into the extraordinary. Musicians played softly from alcoves, flutes, lyres, sometimes the haunting sound of the hydraulis, a water-powered organ. Between courses, dancers moved in slow circles, their steps measured, their faces impassive. Perfumed oils were poured into shallow lamps so that the room filled not only with music, but with scent. Cinnamon, myrrh, spikenard brought from distant Arabia. The meal, in all its senses, was a journey across the empire's geography. Each flavor and fragrance reminded the guests that Rome's reach extended to the ends of the known world. To dine was, therefore, to rule. The act of serving exotic dishes was a subtle form of propaganda, proof that the emperor's power could command the farthest provinces to yield their rarest treasures. The very arrangement of the banquet reinforced social order. Who reclined closest to the emperor, who poured the wine, who spoke, and who listened. Every gesture was watched. In such an atmosphere sincerity had no place. Compliments were currency, and silence was often safer than wit. Behind the scenes the machinery of this elegance was relentless. Hundreds of servants labored invisibly. The cocus, or head cook, directing a small army of kitchen slaves. The archimagirus, responsible for sauces and presentation. The scissor who carved meats with practiced grace before the guests. Amphorae of oil, wine, and fish sauce were carried from storerooms. Silver plates were polished until they reflected the lamplight like still water. Food arrived from every corner of the empire. Grain from Egypt, spices from India, hams from Gaul, honey from Crete. The wealth of nations was consumed in a single evening, and yet beneath the calm surface of etiquette, there existed an undercurrent of unease. The banquet's perfection was its own kind of tyranny. Every guest understood that a single misstep, a misplaced word, a frown misread, a toast omitted, could unravel favor. The emperor's mood governed the room like weather. Laughter rose only when he smiled. If his gaze darkened, conversation faltered. The most dangerous silence in Rome was the moment before he spoke. Poison, in such a setting, was both literal and metaphorical. Actual poisoning was rare but feared, a fear intensified by centuries of rumor. Tales of deadly banquets circulated endlessly, of rivals silenced through bitter wine, of heirs felled by tainted figs, of emperors whose food tasters collapsed before them. Whether these stories were true mattered less than their persistence. To the Roman imagination, power and poison were inseparable. Even when the dishes were untouched, suspicion fed the mind more deeply than any meal could satisfy. Still, the ritual continued. Night after night. The guests reclined, the slaves poured, the candles burned low. As twilight deepened, the meal entered its final stage. The secundae mensae, or dessert. Trays of fruits and nuts appeared. Dates, figs, pomegranates, almonds glazed with honey. Sweet wines followed, their richness softening the sharpness of earlier flavors. The emperor would raise his cup for the last toast, often to the gods, sometimes to the health of Rome itself. In that gesture lay the paradox of imperial dining. to drink as a symbol of life, while always aware that death might lie in the very cup being lifted. When the guests departed, the hall grew silent again. Slaves collected the remains, swept the marble floors, extinguished the lamps one by one. The faint scent of wine and incense lingered in the air like the echo of distant music. Outside, the streets of Rome had already fallen into their uneasy sleep. Somewhere, another banquet was being prepared for another evening, as if repetition itself could keep the empire from fading. The emperor would dine again tomorrow, and tomorrow, as always, he would wonder, though never aloud, whether the rituals that celebrated his power might also conceal his doom. The habit of dining became so essential, so woven into the structure of Roman life, that the boundary between ceremony and necessity disappeared entirely. To eat was to demonstrate control over fortune itself, and from that illusion, the next chapter of Rome's story emerged, one in which food became the most refined instrument of politics, and the banquet table the quiet theatre of power. The soft residue of wine still clung to the emperor's fingers as he rested his hand upon the arm of the couch. Around him, the great dining hall breathed with the faint echo of departing footsteps. The meal had ended, yet its true purpose was only beginning to take shape in the minds of those who had attended. Every gesture, every word, every placement of a cup or a cushion had been part of an unspoken script, one that governed not just the evening's etiquette, but the empire itself. For in Rome, the banquet was never merely a feast. It was a political performance of the highest order. To share the emperor's table was to step into a carefully constructed stage where hierarchy, loyalty, and ambition were illuminated by lamplight. The dishes might glitter with gold leaf, but the true value of the evening lay in proximity. Who reclined closest to the emperor, who poured his wine, who dared to meet his gaze. The layout of the imperial dining room followed invisible lines of authority. The emperor's couch occupied the central position, slightly elevated, its cushions embroidered with the imperial eagle. To his right sat the guest of highest favor, a senator perhaps, or a general recently returned from the frontiers. To his left, another noble of almost equal standing. Beyond these positions, importance diminished in a delicate gradient, like the fading light across a marble floor. To be seated even one couch further away could mark the beginning of decline. Seating was no trivial matter. It determined one's political fate as clearly as any edict or decree. Chroniclers such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio describe how the most powerful men of Rome would study their placement at the table as augurs once read the flight of birds. Those nearer the emperor could whisper their counsel, offer their congratulations, or read subtle shifts in tone and expression. Those farther away were left to interpret silence. Sometimes, a single feast foretold an entire year's worth of fortune, or its collapse. Even the act of serving carried political meaning. Certain slaves, chosen for loyalty or beauty, were assigned to pour the emperor's wine or to present the first dish. These attendants, often eunuchs or freedmen, held a strange kind of invisible influence. They moved between couches, overhearing fragments of conversation, carrying news and impressions that might later shape the emperor's opinion of his guests. To serve was to watch, and to watch was to wield quiet power. The cup, of course, remained the object of universal attention. Silver, gold, sometimes cut from crystal, it passed from hand to hand with reverence, yet also with the weight of fear. For centuries the Romans had believed that true poison could be detected by sight. The metal would tarnish, the liquid would cloud. Yet despite these precautions, suspicion persisted. Tales circulated of substances that left no trace, of potions so subtle that their effects appeared only after hours or days. The idea that one's fate could rest in a sip of wine lent the banquet a tension that no music could soften. And yet, poison in Rome was rarely about chemistry. It was a political metaphor, a way to describe the unseen forces that shaped imperial life. The real toxin was suspicion, a slow, invisible corrosion that ate away at the bonds of trust within the palace. Once introduced, it spread effortlessly. A noble might whisper that another guest had brought a foreign taster. A freedman might remark that the emperor's appetite seemed uncertain. A physician might suggest a new antidote, which in itself implied that someone had reason to fear. Thus the rumor grew, feeding upon the very anxiety it created. At the emperor's table, these tensions mingled with the fragrance of roasted meats and myrrh. Each guest, while appearing relaxed, weighed every word. Compliments had to be offered with care, too warm, and they seemed insincere, too cold, and they might be taken as insult. A jest that provoked laughter one evening could lead to exile the next. The emperor's reactions were studied like sacred texts. When he smiled, those nearby mirrored it instantly. When his eyes grew distant, conversation stilled. Power had its own gravity, and all who dined within its orbit were bound by it. In this way, the banquet mirrored the empire's broader structure. It was a circle around a single point, the emperor, whose moods and whims could tilt the balance of the entire realm. The senators reclining around him represented the provinces, the generals the legions, the poets, the voice of culture and history. The feast was Rome itself, distilled into ritual form, hierarchical, dazzling and perpetually anxious. From the earliest emperors, the ritual of dining as performance had been carefully cultivated. Augustus, who understood the theatre of modesty, preferred simple meals of figs and bread, yet invited his guests to interpret this restraint as moral example. Tiberius, more secretive, hosted smaller gatherings where silence was often mistaken for favor. Caligula transformed banquets into demonstrations of divine ego, ordering his guests to eat pearls or to praise the flavor of gold. Each ruler shaped the meal according to his character, but the underlying structure remained. Power was displayed through food, and loyalty was measured through appetite. The irony, of course, was that the very ritual meant to affirm unity often deepened division. Beneath the polite laughter and polished toasts lay an undercurrent of rivalry, the senators competing for the emperor's attention, the generals resentful of the poets mocking the generals in verse recited later in private salons. The banquet was both a gathering and a test. To survive it required a balance of grace, restraint and fear. It is easy now, from centuries' distance, to imagine these dinners as tranquil tableaux. The emperor reclining, the torches flickering, the guests murmuring in low voices. Yet each of those evenings contained its own quiet drama, the smallest details, a host who delayed the next course, a servant who hesitated with a cup, a guest who declined a dish, could set off ripples of speculation that lasted for weeks. The palace was a chamber of echoes, and every sound returned magnified. In this atmosphere, true friendship was impossible. Even affection became a form of calculation. The emperor himself, surrounded by flatterers and spies, learned to listen without hearing, to smile without trusting. His power, absolute though it appeared, was also his isolation. For when one's table is both throne and trap, every guest becomes a potential executioner, and every meal a rehearsal for mortality. As the night deepened, the servants cleared away the final dishes. The lamps burned lower, their flames bending in the faint draughts that moved through the hall. Outside, the Tiber glimmered faintly beneath the moon. The emperor rose, his attendants bowing in unison, and the guests followed, their expressions composed, their minds heavy with unspoken calculations. By morning, some would boast of their nearness to him, others would worry over an expression they had misread. The banquet was over, but its consequences were just beginning to unfold, and so the ritual continued, night after night, ruler after ruler, until the theatre of dining became indistinguishable from the politics of survival. From this slow, perilous evolution emerged a darker art, the mastery of substances, herbs and whispers that could end a life more quietly than any sword. Thus, from the stage of the emperor's table, we descend into the deeper shadows of Rome, where the poisoner's craft awaited, invisible and patient in the hands of those who understood that death, too, could be served as delicately as a meal. The candles had long since guttered out, leaving only the faintest glow of embers in the brazier. Beyond the palace walls, the city lay silent, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. In such hours, when the marble floors grew cold and the courtyards emptied of sound, another kind of power moved quietly through Rome. Not the power of armies or decrees, but of mixtures, powders and draughts known only to a few. It was said that in the empire's final centuries, more lives were ended at the dinner table than on the battlefield. The empire of stone rested upon a subtler foundation, the poisoner's art. It began, as many arts did, with curiosity. The Romans inherited their knowledge of poisons from Greece and the East, from physicians, herbalists, and magicians, whose recipes mingled science with superstition. The line between medicine and poison was never clear. Galen, the famed Roman physician, once remarked that only the dose distinguishes a poison from a cure. In that uncertainty, the poisoner found his domain: hemlock, aconite, nightshade. These were not instruments of murder in themselves, but tools, awaiting the hand that would decide their purpose. The most infamous of these was hemlock, Conium maculatum, the same plant that ended the life of Socrates centuries earlier in Athens. When properly prepared, it produced a calm, creeping paralysis, first numbing the limbs, then silencing the breath. In Rome, its use was rare among the common people, but whispered to appear in certain state executions or discreet eliminations of rivals. A few historians even suggest that it was kept among the imperial stores, measured and catalogued like any other weapon. Then there was aconite, known as the queen of poisons, extracted from the monkshood flower. Its very touch could burn the skin. The ancients believed it was born from the foam of Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades, when Hercules dragged the beast from the underworld. Whether or not they believed this tale, its effects were terrifyingly real: violent chills, vomiting, and finally the slow stopping of the heart. Roman naturalists like Pliny the Elder warned that aconite was so potent that its fumes alone could kill small animals. It was forbidden to grow it within the city limits, a law more often ignored than obeyed. From farther east came substances even stranger. Traders from India and Persia brought powders whose names the Romans could barely pronounce: strychnos, opium, arsenicon. These exotic imports lent the poisoner a new vocabulary of death. Arsenic, in particular, fascinated them. Its pale, tasteless dust could be mixed with wine or honey and left no trace upon the tongue. Centuries later, it would earn the title the inheritance powder, but even in Rome it was already the weapon of choice for those who preferred discretion to spectacle. Yet the true genius of Roman poisoners lay not merely in what they used, but in how they concealed it. In an age before glass flasks and chemical tests, their tools were as much social as scientific. They relied on secrecy, reputation, and rumor. A skilled poisoner rarely dirtied his own hands. He manipulated servants, cooks, and cupbearers, often without their knowledge. Sometimes the poison was not even real. A whispered accusation could destroy a rival more effectively than the toxin itself. In the empire of suspicion, fear was the deadliest ingredient. One name haunted the chronicles of this dark craft: Locusta. She was said to be the first professional poisoner of Rome, a woman whose knowledge of venoms earned both awe and terror. Active during the reigns of Claudius and Nero, Locusta's reputation became legend. When Emperor Claudius's death was followed by Nero's swift rise, many whispered that her hand had prepared the fatal dish. Tacitus, never one to spare the grotesque, records that Nero later rewarded her with estates and protection, even ordering her to train others in her methods. Whether these accounts were exaggerated or not, her name became synonymous with the art itself. To drink from Locusta's cup was to court death. But even for those less infamous, the art of poison demanded knowledge, not only of herbs but of human nature. The poisoner's work was as psychological as it was chemical. He studied his target's habits, what they drank, when they dined, whom they trusted. The goal was not merely to kill, but to make the death appear natural: a fever, a fainting, an unlucky illness. In an age when physicians lacked understanding of microbes or infection, almost any symptom could be explained away. Thus, the poisoner operated under the perfect cloak of ignorance. Roman writers treated poison with a mix of fascination and moral disgust. Seneca, ever the philosopher, condemned it as the coward's blade. Pliny wrote that its use was unmanly, the mark of one who feared open confrontation. Yet the same men dined in circles, where such things were rumored daily. The contradiction was part of Rome's nature, to celebrate strength while surviving through cunning. What is most striking, though, is how little evidence survives of confirmed poisonings. For all the stories, Claudius's mushrooms, Britannicus's cup, Germanicus's mysterious sickness in Syria, historians remain uncertain. The accounts were written decades later, often by authors eager to moralize or entertain. What mattered was not whether the poison existed, but that people believed it might. The empire's greatest danger was not poison in the cup, but the idea that any cup could be poisoned. This climate of fear changed the behavior of emperors and courtiers alike. Some emperors employed official tasters, men who sampled every dish before it reached the imperial lips. Others developed obsessions with antidotes. Mithridates of Pontus, an Eastern king long before Rome's dominance, was said to have consumed small doses of every known toxin to build immunity, a practice later imitated by emperors such as Nero and Marcus Aurelius. These antidotal mixtures, known as Mithridatium, became prized across the empire, evolving into complex recipes containing dozens of ingredients: honey, opium, cinnamon, myrrh, even bits of ground viper. Whether they worked or not, they offered a sense of control in a world ruled by uncertainty. Roman physicians, too, became part of this uneasy system. Some were accused of acting as poisoners themselves, selling their knowledge to the highest bidder. Others tried to dispel the myths, insisting that nature's remedies could heal more often than harm. But medicine in Rome was still a young art. Dissection was rare, anatomy poorly understood. A sudden death might be blamed on a curse, a god's anger, or the malice of a rival, and so the poisoner thrived, not in the laboratory, but in the imagination of a fearful society. Even ordinary Romans participated in this web of belief. Market vendors whispered that certain wines were cursed, that figs from the east carried venom, that perfumes mixed with too much cassia could bring madness. Poison had become a language, a way of speaking about betrayal, decay, and the unseen dangers of luxury. The empire that had conquered the known world now found itself haunted by invisible threats within its own walls. Still, for every whispered death, there was another motive beneath it: inheritance, jealousy, power. Wives were accused of poisoning husbands to seize wealth, sons of poisoning fathers to claim estates. Some of these charges were real, many were convenient excuses for political purges. Under emperors like Tiberius and Domitian, trials for poisoning beneficium became tools of control, accusations that could remove any opponent without the mess of open violence. In such a system, truth was irrelevant. The fear itself was enough. It was this atmosphere that gave rise to a peculiar paradox. The poisoner's art, though despised, became a mirror of the empire's own condition. Just as the poisoner worked unseen, manipulating causes and effects from the shadows, so too did Rome's rulers govern through intrigue and deceit. Every law, every feast, every promise concealed a dose of danger. Power, like aconite, could not be touched without risk. And yet, even in this darkness, there was a strange kind of artistry. To mix the perfect poison required precision, patience, and courage. Too much, and suspicion would fall immediately. Too little, and the victim would survive. It was, in its own terrible way, a craft of balance, a reflection of the Roman obsession with mastery over nature. The same empire that built aqueducts and roads also perfected the art of invisible death. As dawn crept once more over the Tiber, the poisoner's world retreated into secrecy. The cups were washed, the herbs ground to dust, the stories passed in murmurs from slave to noble, noble to chronicler. Some claimed the emperor himself kept a secret cabinet of poisons, not for use, but as a reminder of mortality. Whether true or not, it was fitting. Rome's power had always carried its own antidote within it. For what began as curiosity, a fascination with plants and potions, had become a philosophy of empire itself. To rule was to poison, and to survive was to know the antidote. Every alliance, every gesture, every feast contained both. And as the centuries turned, and emperors rose and fell, the art endured, evolving from rumor into ritual, until it could no longer be distinguished from the act of governance itself. When the Republic fell, and the empire was born, the air in Rome changed, not suddenly, but in the way twilight slips into night, unhurried and inevitable. The public feasts and bloody elections of the old republic faded, replaced by private dinners in marble atriums, where conversation moved in measured tones and glances carried more meaning than decrees. The poisoner's art, once a rumor at the fringes of society, found its way into the very heart of Rome's new order, and at the center of that heart, serene and untouchable, stood Livia Drusilla, the first empress of Rome. She had entered history quietly, as though stepping through a curtain rather than bursting onto a stage. Born into one of the oldest patrician families, she was already married and pregnant when she met Octavian, the young man who would become Augustus, Rome's first emperor. To their union, which began under scandal and political necessity, endured for more than 50 years, longer than most Roman marriages, and certainly longer than many of Augustus's wars. Together, they formed the first dynasty of Rome, and yet, where Augustus ruled the empire with laws and armies, Livia ruled it with silence. Contemporary writers described her not as a queen or goddess, but as something subtler, a presence like incense in the air. Tacitus would later call her a woman who wielded a man's power under the name of wife. Suetonius, ever eager for sensation, hinted at darker things, that those who stood between her son Tiberius and the throne tended to vanish, that their deaths were quiet, natural, convenient, but the sources themselves are shaped as much by gossip as by fact. Livia lived so carefully that even her enemies had little to hold against her but suspicion. The empire she inhabited was a world of surfaces, polished marble, serene statues, the gentle rustle of silks and togas in the breeze. The imperial palace on the Palatine Hill overlooked the city like a watchful deity. From its terraces, one could see the rooftops of Rome spreading endlessly outward, the temples, the forums, the aqueducts gleaming in sunlight. To most Romans, Augustus and Livia were not people at all, but symbols of divine order, the living embodiment of stability, after a century of chaos. Yet stability came at a cost. To preserve peace, the imperial household had to become a theatre of perfection, and in theatre, there was no room for imperfection, no room for rivals. The rumors began early. Augustus's nephew Marcellus, young, handsome, and popular, died at 19 after a brief illness. Whispers said Livia had arranged it, clearing the path for her own son, Tiberius. Later came Gaius and Lucius Caesar, Augustus's grandsons and heirs, who both died before their time, each under mysterious circumstances. The official accounts spoke of fever, fatigue, accidents. Rome murmured other explanations. By the time Augustus himself fell ill in 14 CE, the city was certain of the pattern. Wherever succession loomed, death followed, and Livia remained standing amid the ashes of possibility. It is tempting, from a distance of centuries, to treat these stories as fact, but the truth is less certain, and perhaps more haunting. Ancient sources were written long after the events they describe, often by men nostalgic for the lost freedoms of the Republic. Livia, powerful, composed and female, was an easy symbol for their resentment. Poison for them was not only a tool of murder, but a metaphor for corruption, the invisible infection that had turned Rome's liberty into monarchy. To accuse Livia of poisoning was to accuse the empire itself of deceit. Still, the image endures, the empress moving through shadowed corridors, her steps soft on mosaic floors, her servants silent and obedient. She does not raise her voice. She does not need to. Every glance, every pause in speech carries intention. Even the smallest gestures, the placement of a cup, the delay of a dish, acquire a kind of ritual meaning. The banquet, once a place of celebration, becomes a stage for invisible warfare. Livia's genius, if it existed, was never in poison, but in control. Her life was a study in restraint. Unlike later empresses, Messalina, Agrippina, Julia Domna, Livia never flaunted her influence. She dressed simply, in modest colors. She walked without escort when possible. She managed the palace accounts herself. She cultivated the image of the ideal Roman matron, devoted to the household gods and loyal to her husband. In doing so, she redefined womanhood at the summit of empire, but behind that calm exterior, she shaped policy, arranged marriages, and guided Augustus's appointments. It was said that no law was passed without her counsel. She was, as one historian called her, the quiet architect of empire. If poison played any role in her story, it was not in the literal sense, but as an idea, the invisible thread running through Roman power. For in a world where every alliance was temporary, and every heir a potential rival, the notion of poison provided a vocabulary for fear. To die of poison was to die of politics. Whether or not Livia ever mixed a deadly draught, she certainly mastered the art of survival, which in Rome was often the same thing. When Augustus finally died, some said he had eaten too many figs from his garden, figs that Livia herself had tended. Others swore she had smeared them with venom before offering them to him. Tacitus reports the rumor but adds, with rare honesty, that such tales belong to the talk of slaves. What we do know is that she ensured his deification. Augustus became a god, his temples raised across the empire, and that she became his high priestess. The woman accused of killing the emperor thus became the guardian of his immortal cult. It was an irony too perfect for Rome to ignore. Her son Tiberius succeeded to the throne, fulfilling the destiny many believed she had long prepared. Their relationship, however, was not peaceful. The historian Cassius Dio describes a cold tension between mother and son, the emperor resentful of her influence, the empress unwilling to withdraw. When she died at the age of 86, Tiberius refused to attend her funeral or grant her immediate deification. Perhaps it was spite. Perhaps it was fear of what her memory represented. Only under her grandson Claudius, years later, would she be officially declared divine, Diva Augusta, the first woman among the gods of Rome. Even in death, her presence lingered. Statues of her serene face appeared in temples, her name invoked in prayers for domestic harmony. Yet beneath that marble calm, her legend had already taken root, not as goddess or saint, but as the shadow that moved behind the emperor's throne. Her story, retold by poets and chroniclers, became the archetype of the dangerous woman in power, subtle, patient, deadly if crossed. And so the myth of the poisoned banquet found its matriarch. In truth, Livia's power lay not in toxins or daggers, but in the slow poison of perception. She taught Rome that silence could be more terrifying than violence, that influence need not raise its voice to be absolute. Her world was not one of screams or conspiracies, but of measured words and long sleepless nights, the kind where decisions are made without witnesses, and histories are rewritten with the turn of a ring. The empire she left behind would remember her less for what she did, than for what she might have done, and in that uncertainty, her legend became immortal. The banquet of Roman power would continue, emperors dining, toasting, fearing, but now somewhere in the dim candlelight, there would always be the faint image of a woman in shadow, watching, silent, unmoving. The first empress, the first ghost at the imperial table. In the final years of his life, Augustus had begun to resemble the empire he had built, vast, weary, and carved by time, into quiet perfection. The sharp energy of his youth had long since faded, replaced by a deliberate calm that moved through his days like the slow procession of seasons. The man who had once conquered the world through subtlety and patience now spent his hours among gardens, scrolls, and the measured rituals of an aging god-king. The wars were over, the republic had dissolved into memory. The Senate, the armies, the people, all bent beneath his steady invisible hand. Yet even gods grow tired. Augustus's villa at Nola, near Naples, was a place of cultivated peace. Olive trees lined the hills, fountains whispered in the courtyards, the late summer air hung heavy with figs and laurel. It was here, in August of the year 14 CE, that Rome's first emperor would meet his end, not in battle or rebellion, but in a room scented with fruit and candle smoke. For all his grandeur, Augustus died as he had lived, quietly, with the machinery of empire humming softly around him. The story that survives is woven from both truth and rumor, a tapestry of admiration and suspicion. Ancient historians, ever drawn to drama, could not resist the temptation to embroider his death with meaning. Suetonius records that Augustus dined lightly that evening, eating dried bread and figs from his own garden. He was known to have a fondness for them. He believed that fruit grown under his eye carried good fortune. The orchard, carefully tended by his slaves, stood within view of his chamber. Some said that he would walk among the trees each morning, inspecting the leaves, plucking a fig, and handing it to Livia with the fondness of long habit. And it was those same figs, they whispered later, that carried death. According to Tacitus and Cassius Dio, the rumor spread almost instantly after his passing, that Livia, seeking to hasten her son Tiberius's succession, had smeared the figs with poison before presenting them to her husband. The story was irresistible. The serene empress, the loyal wife turned executioner, the fruit of life transformed into a silent weapon. But as with all Roman tales, it is difficult to separate belief from invention. What we know is simpler, and perhaps sadder. Augustus was 75 years old, his health already fragile. Years of travel, campaigning, and political strain had left their mark. His doctors, uncertain of the causes of aging, prescribed the usual mixtures: honey, wine, mild herbs, but nothing could slow the quiet disintegration of the body that had carried Rome into empire. He had returned to Nola to rest, surrounded by attendants, physicians, and the constant unobtrusive care of Livia. In his final hours, he was lucid, calm, almost ceremonial. Suetonius recounts that he asked for a mirror, had his hair arranged, and inquired of those present whether he had played his part well in the drama of life. If so, he said, then applaud me as I exit. Whether he truly spoke those words, or whether they were crafted later by poets eager for closure, they have the stillness of a final breath. It is the kind of line history invents because it needs to believe that power dies gracefully. He died on the 19th of August, a date that would forever carry his name. His body was embalmed, his image displayed for the mourning of the people, and his ashes placed in the grand mausoleum of Augustus on the field of Mars. The Senate declared him a god, devised Augustus, the first mortal to be officially absorbed into the Roman pantheon. The Republic, already a ghost, now vanished entirely. Rome had entered the age of deified rulers, where emperors would live and die not as men but as eternal symbols. Livia, ever composed, managed the ceremonies with precision. She ensured that the succession of Tiberius proceeded without disruption, that the empire remained intact, that the illusion of seamless continuity endured. To the people, she was the image of devotion, the grieving wife who had stood beside her husband for half a century. But in the whispers of Rome, another story took root. Some said she had smiled too serenely, that her grief seemed rehearsed, that her gaze lingered on her son with quiet satisfaction. They recalled how the heirs before Tiberius, Marcellus, Gaius, Lucius, had all died mysteriously young. They noted how Livia's influence had grown even as Augustus's strength had waned. And now, with the emperor gone, she stood unchallenged as Metapatria, the mother of the empire. Tacitus, writing a century later, did not claim to know the truth. He merely recorded that suspicion clung to her name. He added, perhaps with a hint of bitterness, that such suspicions were the natural consequence of power. In a court where every ambition was hidden behind courtesy, even the purest act of care could appear sinister. Rome, ever fearful of its own shadows, could not accept that its first emperor might have simply died of age. There had to be a hand guiding fate, and Livia's was the most obvious. Still, when we strip away the rumor, what remains is a quieter story, an old man fading into the twilight of his own creation. The empire he had built from the bones of the Republic would outlive him, but its spirit was already changing. The ideals of liberty and virtue, once spoken in the Forum, had become ritual words, repeated in marble halls where no one truly listened. Power had found its final tranquil form, hereditary, divine and absolute. Augustus had once claimed to have found Rome a city of brick, and left it a city of marble. It was true, but marble, for all its beauty, does not breathe. It endures in silence. In the still air of his death chamber, beneath the cool stone vaults of Nola, the last breath of the Republic dissipated like incense. Outside, the orchards continued their slow rhythm. Slaves gathered the remaining figs, careful not to bruise them, unaware that those simple fruits would become part of legend. The villa's fountains murmured, the same sound they had made for decades, indifferent to the passing of emperors, and somewhere beyond the hills, the legions waited for news. not of war but of succession. The empire, like a body after the heart has stopped, continued to move out of habit. In Rome the Senate convened, their words carefully measured. Statues of Augustus were draped in laurel, sacrifices were offered at dawn. His name, already immortal in stone, now ascended formally among the gods. The man who had ended 100 years of civil strife would be worshipped for centuries. But behind every new god stands a mortal who remembers his face, and for Rome that face belonged to Livia. Her silence after his death spoke louder than any declaration. She ensured that the transition to Tiberius was smooth, unthreatened, and absolute. The empire neither mourned nor celebrated. It simply continued, as though the emperor had not died at all, merely changed form. And in this strange continuity, in the illusion of eternity, Rome's greatest illusion was perfected. That power could live forever, untouched by decay. Whether Livia poisoned the figs or not, no longer mattered. The legend had already become truer than the fact. Rome needed the story, a human hand to explain the slow, invisible death of freedom. And so the image endured, the emperor in his garden, plucking the fruit of his labor, offering it to his wife, and tasting at last the sweetness and bitterness of empire. The figs from his orchard, still ripening in the sun, hung like small golden moons against the leaves, serene, silent, and perfectly ordinary. No witness could tell which of them carried death. But perhaps that was the lesson Augustus left behind, that in Rome death and devotion were never opposites, merely reflections of the same eternal design. And as the sun set over Nola, its light touching the domes and temples far away in the capital, the empire entered its second dawn, colder, quieter, and ruled by ghosts. When Augustus died, the empire passed not only to his stepson Tiberius, but to a new kind of silence. Where Augustus had cloaked his rule in ceremony and calm, Tiberius ruled beneath a cloud of unease, the stillness of deep water rather than the clarity of air. He was a soldier by nature, not a showman, a man of calculation, not charm. And in the marble heart of Rome, surrounded by senators who smiled too easily, and slaves who listened too closely, he began to feel the breath of danger everywhere. In the 10th year of his reign, he left Rome. He claimed exhaustion, a need for peace. But peace was never what awaited him. The island of Capri, rising from the Tyrrhenian Sea like a fragment of some drowned god's palace, became his refuge and his prison. Sheer cliffs fell into waters the color of metal. The villa walls glowed pale against the sea. From there, Tiberius could look back toward the mainland, toward the capital he no longer trusted. Distance became his armor. At first it seemed a retreat into serenity. Capri was lush with gardens, citrus groves, and shaded courtyards open to the sea wind. But as months passed into years, a strange transformation overtook the island. The imperial villa, Villa Jovis, the house of Jupiter, began to harden into something else. Guards doubled. Servants whispered. Visitors were screened and shadowed. The kitchens, once places of laughter and spice, turned into laboratories of fear. Every plate, every cup, every knife was inspected and sealed by the Praetorians before reaching the emperor's table. He had inherited from Livia not only power, but her caution, distilled into paranoia. In his eyes, every gesture became a possible deception, every flavor a mask. The imperial banquets that had once dazzled Rome were reduced to ritual, solitary meals under watchful lamps, food tasted by slaves who prayed to survive their duty. Suetonius tells us that Tiberius's appetite shrank with his trust. He ate simple fare, bread, fish, fruit, but he would linger over the food, examining it, as though waiting for it to confess. The taste of wine became a test. The scent of herbs, an accusation. Poison had become less a weapon than a ghost. Something unseen, perhaps unreal, but powerful enough to govern his every movement. And on Capri, the emperor who ruled the known world began to disappear into rumor. Visitors described him as spectral, appearing at odd hours on the terraces, gazing out at the sea. He spoke little, but his eyes, it was said, never rested. Messengers arrived from Rome carrying petitions, reports, and accusations. the lifeblood of an empire that now ruled itself through fear. Tiberius would read them in silence, then order trials, executions, confiscations. The island's isolation made it the perfect stage for invisible cruelty. Down below the cliffs, soldiers maintained watchtowers and secret cells. The condemned were said to be hurled into the sea, though whether this was truth or invention mattered little. Fear itself had become Tiberius's most effective instrument, but perhaps the most haunting detail lies not in his brutality, but in his loneliness. Historians like Tacitus and Cassius Dio, writing long after his death, could not resist painting him as a monster. Yet beneath their hostility, there flickers something more human, a man consumed by the same poison he sought to avoid. He had fled Rome to escape treachery, only to find that isolation magnified it. The island, surrounded by endless sea, offered no escape from suspicion. Each night, guards patrolled the corridors of Villa Jovis, their torches flickering against marble walls. The emperor slept behind locked doors, his bed surrounded by watchmen sworn to die before allowing any assassin near. Yet the danger he feared was not of blades or daggers, it was the invisible kind, the one that dissolved in water, hid in honey, slipped through the lips unnoticed. He trusted no one completely, not his slaves, not his generals, not even his own blood. Letters from the capital arrived sealed in wax, and he would study them before touching, as though words themselves might carry venom. In this atmosphere, paranoia became policy. The trials for treason, ministers, multiplied. Senators and nobles fell one by one, condemned for careless jokes, gestures, silences. Every banquet in Rome became a cautious performance, every friendship a gamble. The empire, mirroring its ruler, learned to smile without belief. And still, Tiberius watched the sea. He was nearly 70 when he began to speak of omens, strange lights over the water, birds that refused to sing, dreams of Augustus calling to him from beyond. Whether these were hallucinations or simply the reflection of guilt, no one could say, but to the slaves of Capri, who moved like shadows through the villa, it was clear that the emperor was haunted not by ghosts, but by his own imagination. When death finally came in 37 CE, it was quiet, unceremonious. Some said he had been smothered with a pillow, others that he died naturally. Either way, few mourned. The man who had ruled through fear, left behind an empire trained to obey, not to love. Capri, once a retreat of beauty, was remembered as a fortress of terror. Yet, in the soft wind that still moves through its ruins today, there lingers a trace of something more complicated. The sound of a man who sought safety so desperately that he destroyed peace itself. The empire he inherited from Augustus had been born in control, the one he left behind was built on suspicion. Between them lies the true legacy of Rome's early emperors, power not as splendor, but as isolation. And somewhere on the cliffs of Capri, perhaps beneath the broken walls of Villa Jovis, the echoes remain, the sound of a knife scraping a plate, the slow breath of an emperor who could no longer taste without fear. When Tiberius died in 37 CE, the empire exhaled, or thought it did. The long shadow of fear that had stretched from Capri to the Senate seemed, for a brief moment, to dissolve. In its place came light, noise, and color. The young emperor Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, whom history would name Caligula, arrived in Rome like dawn breaking after an endless night. He was only 24, his face was familiar to the Roman people, the son of Germanicus, the grandson of Agrippina the Elder, the great-nephew of Augustus himself. He was the golden heir the empire had long waited for, the antithesis of Tiberius's gloom. When he entered the city, the streets bloomed with garlands, crowds chanted his name, sacrifices filled the altars. It was said that for the first months of his reign, he could do no wrong. The empire, exhausted by suspicion, mistook brightness for safety, but light can also blind. The banquets of Caligula began as celebrations and ended as visions, part theatre, part madness, part divine assertion. He had learned on Capri that power could be secured, not only by fear, but by awe. So, he turned the emperor's table into something mythic, a stage upon which the empire itself performed. In the triclinium, the great dining hall, Marble couches formed a horseshoe around low tables of polished onyx, torches flickered in gold sconces, and the scent of myrrh clung to the air. The guests were senators, generals, poets, and foreign envoys, all reclining in deliberate ease, though none truly relaxed. For Caligula's feasts were not merely meals, they were proclamations. Every gesture, every bite, was watched, weighed, remembered. The dishes that arrived were both absurd and magnificent. Pliny the Elder would later write of meals served upon plates of solid gold, food sprinkled with gold dust, meats marinated in rare perfumes. There were stories of pearls dissolved in vinegar, jewels turned to drink, a ritual said to have been inspired by Cleopatra herself. Fish and birds were imported from across the empire, flamingo tongues from Africa, peacock brains from Asia Minor, oysters from Britain. Sometimes the emperor ate nothing at all, content instead to watch his guests navigate the excess. To refuse food might insult him, to eat too eagerly might amuse him. Both were dangerous. There was something theatrical in his cruelty, though whether it was born of malice or madness remains uncertain. Suetonius and Cassius Dio, writing long after his death, would describe him as unhinged, a man who declared himself a god, who married his sister, who made his horse a priest. Yet woven among their exaggerations lies a kernel of truth, that Caligula used food and spectacle to blur the line between mortality and divinity. He saw himself not as a ruler of men, but as something more ancient, a living embodiment of power, as Jupiter upon the earth. And so his banquets became offerings not to the gods, but from one. Gold in his mind was not wealth but essence, the color of eternity, the texture of immortality. When he ordered his cooks to coat meats and fruits in beaten gold, he was not merely displaying extravagance, he was consuming a symbol, devouring the empire itself in edible form. The guests who dined beside him participated in a ritual that was at once divine and desecrated, a communion of fear disguised as pleasure. The quiet paranoia of Tiberius had become something else entirely, a performance of omnipotence. If Tiberius's fear had hidden him from the world, Caligula's delusion swallowed it whole. Still, in the shimmering hall of his feasts, unease persisted. Beneath the laughter and the clinking of goblets, there was always a pause, a hesitation before the first bite, a glance toward the emperor's expression. The memory of poison lingered in Rome's collective mind. For though Caligulus loved excess, he also loved control, and his unpredictability made every banquet a kind of test. Senators recalled moments when he would suddenly order a guest's execution mid-meal, then resume eating, remarking on the flavor of the wine. Others spoke of nights when he distributed fortunes in gold, only to demand them back by morning. He could turn mercy into mockery, cruelty into entertainment. In that atmosphere, the act of dining became a slow, suffocating ritual, every smile rehearsed, every toast a gamble. The emperor himself was said to prefer night to day. Many of his banquets began after sunset, continuing until dawn. The air grew thick with incense and candle smoke. Musicians played softly, their lyres trembling over the murmur of conversation. And in those long hours, as torches burned low, guests found themselves suspended between delight and dread, intoxicated not by wine, but by the emperor's presence. There are whispers of his fascination with the gods, especially Jupiter and Bacchus. Some nights he dressed as one, adorned with garlands, his face painted, declaring that Rome should worship him as they did Olympus. Others said he placed himself beside statues of the gods at table, demanding equal reverence. All, whether myth or truth, it reveals something deeper. The banquets were his altar, and those who attended were his worshippers. But grandeur, like gold, tarnishes in time. The empire soon began to choke on its own luxury. The treasury emptied. Famine followed extravagance. Caligula's behavior, once eccentric, turned sinister. He built floating palaces on ships across Lake Nemi, feasting upon them as if to escape the weight of land. He walked upon gardens of marble, dusted with jewels, and still, he demanded more brilliance, more awe, more proof that he was beyond mortality. Yet even a god must eat carefully. Historians tell us that in the end, Caligula's downfall came not from poison but from steel, assassinated by his own guards in 41 CE. But perhaps there was poison of another kind, the slow intoxication of power, the madness born from unending indulgence. His golden tables, once radiant, became symbols of decay, reminders that excess itself can be fatal. When the banquet lamps were finally extinguished, and the corridors of his palace fell silent, Rome was left with an aftertaste, bitter, metallic, unforgettable. The line between splendor and ruin had dissolved, just as pearls had in vinegar, and in the quiet that followed his death, the empire stood once more between two shadows, the paranoia of Tiberius behind it, and the chaos of Caligula before. When the shouting around Caligula's assassination finally faded, what remained was not triumph, but confusion. The empire had decapitated its god, and for a moment there was no clear successor. The Senate quarreled, the Praetorians hesitated, and the people watched in wary silence. In that void, history performed one of its quietest reversals. Hiding behind a curtain in the imperial palace, trembling and uncertain, was Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, Caligula's uncle, thought by many to be weak, slow, even simple-minded. The guards upon finding him did not kill him, they saluted. In the long and strange tradition of Roman destiny, the man once mocked as a fool became emperor. Claudius was 50 years old when the purple fell unexpectedly upon his shoulders. Where Caligula had dazzled, Claudius preferred stillness. He was a historian, a linguist, a bureaucrat. His reign, unlike his predecessors, unfolded in the rhythm of documentation, edicts, censuses, letters. He ate simply, slept regularly, and sought order where others had sought glory. Yet Rome was never a place that allowed quiet men to remain untouched. At first his rule seemed almost accidental, as though he had stumbled into it and decided to stay. But Claudius possessed an understated intelligence. He understood that survival required the careful balancing of fear and favor. He restored stability, expanded citizenship, built aqueducts, and presided over conquests in Britain. His name for a time became synonymous with moderation. But moderation in Rome was fragile. Around him swirled those who understood power differently, freedmen like Narcissus and Pallas, and above all the women of the Julio-Claudian line, ambitious, intelligent and ruthless. Among them stood Agrippina the Younger, his niece and eventual wife, whose beauty was matched only by her hunger for control. By the time she entered his life, Claudius had already buried 3 wives. Each union had been political, each ending steeped in scandal. Agrippina, daughter of Germanicus and sister of Caligula, understood the empire's pulse better than anyone alive. She presented herself as the cure for instability, a link between dynasties, a symbol of continuity. Claudius, weary of intrigue, accepted her. It was perhaps his final mistake. In the marble halls of the Palatine, a strange quiet fell over the imperial household. Claudius, aging and increasingly detached, turned his attention to scholarship and governance. Agrippina turned hers to succession. Her son from a previous marriage, the young Lucius Domitius Anobarbus, later known as Nero, had become the vessel of her ambitions. Claudius's own son Britannicus, though legitimate, was young and politically isolated. The empire began to whisper again, this time not of gods or madness, but of dinners. Claudius was known for his fondness for food. Unlike Tiberius's austerity, or Caligula's theatrical extravagance, his appetite was genuine, almost ordinary. He enjoyed hearty meals, particularly mushrooms, which he called cibus deorum, the food of the gods. It is a phrase that would later acquire a grim irony. It was October of 54 CE when the banquet took place, the one that would end his reign and his life. The sources differ on detail, as they often do in Rome's darker tales, but the outline remains the same. The emperor, dining with his household in one of the palace villas, some say on the Esquiline Hill, others in his coastal retreat, was served a dish of mushrooms prepared by his cooks and overseen by Agrippina's agents. Whether she herself planned it or merely permitted it, remains forever uncertain. Ancient historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio agreed only on one thing. that the meal marked the passing of one emperor and the quiet rise of another. The poison, they say, was administered not in wine, as was customary, but hidden within the mushrooms themselves. Perhaps Amanita phalloides, the death-cap fungus, or a similar toxin derived from herbs. Claudius ate heartily at first, then began to falter, his speech slurred, his face grew pale. Servants, uncertain, hesitated to act. Agrippina, calm, suggested that he retire to his chamber to rest. What followed unfolded not in shouts but in whispers. Some say the emperor vomited violently, and that a physician loyal to Agrippina assisted his end by placing a feather dipped in poison down his throat, under the pretext of helping him purge the meal. Others claim he lingered for hours, half conscious, while Agrippina ensured no antidotes reached him. Outside, the palace remained eerily quiet. The guards were told their emperor was sleeping. By dawn he was dead. Agrippina moved quickly. Orders were given, messengers sent. The Senate was informed that Claudius, having declared Nero his heir, had passed peacefully in the night. Nero was presented to the Praetorian Guard as emperor before Britannicus could even appear in public. Rome accepted the transition with weary resignation. It had grown used to the silence that followed supper. In death, Claudius was deified, his image raised among the gods of the empire, another figure carved in marble, staring out from eternity. Agrippina's triumph was complete, though brief. Nero would soon outgrow her control, and her own life would end as violently as the husband she may have murdered. The fatal mushrooms became legend, retold for centuries as symbols of Rome's quietest weapon, not the sword, but the banquet. Yet beneath the gossip lies something subtler. Claudius's death marked the last breath of the old Julio-Claudian experiment, the dream that Rome could be ruled by reason, that intellect might temper ambition. In its place rose a new pattern, one that mirrored the empire's own decline: outward splendor, inner decay, and a taste for slow destruction. The mushroom dish, served under lamplight, carried more than poison. It carried inevitability. Rome had built its power on ritual, on spectacle, on the theater of control. By the time Claudius lifted that final bite, the empire itself was already feeding upon its own creation. And so, in the hush of that imperial dining room, while torches burned low, while a single servant carried away the untouched cups, the age of calm governance ended with the faint scent of earth and death. The emperor, who loved words, who wrote histories now lost to time, left the world as quietly as he had entered it, surrounded by those who mistook patience for weakness and loyalty for opportunity. Outside, the night wind moved through the colonnades of the Palatine, carrying with it the softest of sounds, a whisper of leaves, a faint clatter of dishes being cleared, and the closing of another chapter in Rome's long and uneasy feast. When Claudius died, the empire exhaled once again, not in grief, but in the peculiar silence that follows inevitability. Rome had grown accustomed to transitions that arrived like changes in the weather, quiet, irreversible, and best observed from a distance. And so, when Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, barely 17, ascended to the throne, the city did not rejoice so much as watch. At first, there was hope. The new emperor was young, educated, and eloquent. He had been tutored by Seneca, the philosopher who spoke of virtue, mercy, and restraint. His early decrees suggested moderation, even kindness, a return to reason after the slow suffocation of intrigue. Coins were minted, bearing his calm, handsome features. The empire, weary of poison, dared to imagine stability, but youth and power are a volatile mixture. The court soon shifted. Agrippina, the mother who had secured his throne through the death of Claudius, found her influence fading as her son grew into his own appetites. Her presence, once commanding, became intrusive. Nero preferred lighter company, musicians, actors, dancers, the bright, transitory world of performance. The imperial palace began to sound less like a forum of governance, and more like a theater in perpetual rehearsal. Banquets replaced councils, melodies replaced decrees. In Nero's Rome, dining became art. The emperor, who fancied himself a poet and a god, sought to transform even the act of eating into spectacle. The domus transitoria, His first palace was designed not merely as a residence, but as an experience. Halls draped with silk, fountains that spouted rose water, ceilings that revolved like the heavens. Every surface shimmered with gold, ivory, and reflection. At his feasts, light played a central role. Torches flickered against mirrors, amplifying flame until the very air seemed to burn. Perfume filled the spaces between courses, released through hidden vents. Musicians played without pause, and slaves moved in choreographed silence. Guests reclined on couches strewn with petals, while rare dishes, ostrich livers, sea urchins, camel heels, were presented with careful precision. It was indulgence elevated to performance, the emperor himself both host and audience. Yet beneath the golden calm of these evenings ran a current of unease. To be invited to Nero's table was an honor, but also a risk. Like Caligula before him, Nero delighted in unpredictability. He might lavish praise upon a guest one night, and condemn him the next. Flattery became survival. The empire's great families, once proud, now lived as actors in his endless drama. Seneca, his mentor, withdrew quietly, replaced by those who understood how to flatter more convincingly. The court poets began to compare Nero to Apollo, to the sun, to the living flame itself. He listened, smiling, and then one night, the flame became real. In July of 64 CE, a fire broke out in the merchant districts near the Circus Maximus. Fanned by wind and the density of wooden buildings, it spread through the city for 9 days. Ancient sources differ on where Nero was when it began. Some say at Antium, others within the city, but the image that would endure for centuries came from Tacitus and Suetonius. Nero watching from his palace, singing of Troy's burning as Rome itself was consumed. Whether truth or legend, it captured the essence of his reign, a ruler who mistook tragedy for theatre. When the flames subsided, 2/3 of the city lay in ruin. The air reeked of smoke and despair. Nero opened his gardens to the homeless, offered grain at reduced prices, and ordered reconstruction with grand new plans. Yet suspicion lingered that he had himself ordered the fire to clear land for his new vision. The Domus Aurea, the Golden House. This new palace, sprawling across the Palatine and Esquiline hills, became the physical manifestation of his mind. Vast, radiant, impossible. Its dining halls were said to glow with gilded panels and rotating ceilings that rained petals upon diners. Its halls were lined with fountains of wine, its pools reflecting flickers of eternal flame. Nero's banquets here were no longer political events. They were acts of worship, dedicated to himself. He appeared among the guests dressed as a god, his robes shimmering, his voice rising in song. The empire that had once celebrated Jupiter now applauded Nero, for applause was safer than silence. Outside the walls, however, Rome began to starve. The treasury emptied, discontent grew. To deflect suspicion for the fire, Nero blamed a small, obscure sect, the Christians, and ordered their punishment. Their executions became another kind of entertainment: crucifixions, torch burnings, and feasts held in gardens lit by the flames of the condemned. Even the historian Tacitus, no friend to the Christians, wrote of pity spreading among the citizens. Pity not for the faith, but for the cruelty of the spectacle. In the soft glow of those burning gardens, Nero's banquets reached their final grotesque perfection. He dined while the night blazed around him, surrounded by laughter, music, and the faint crackle of human fire. The emperor, who once saw himself as an artist, had made the entire empire his stage. In the years that followed, paranoia tightened around him like ivy around a crumbling column. Agrippina was murdered, first with poison, then with blades when poison failed. Seneca, his teacher, was ordered to die by his own hand. Generals rebelled in the provinces, and whispers grew louder in Rome's corridors. But Nero, insulated by luxury, mistook decay for devotion. He continued to perform, to host, to feast. There is a strange calm in his final days, described by Suetonius as almost dreamlike. When rebellion finally reached the city, and the Senate declared him an enemy of the state, Nero fled. In a villa outside Rome, he dined one last time, eating little. His appetite had deserted him. As soldiers approached, he murmured, "What an artist dies in me," and took his own life. It was the year 68 CE, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had begun with Augustus's measured grandeur and survived through poison, madness, and fear, ended with self-inflicted silence. In the ruins of the Golden House today, beneath the earth and the gardens of later emperors, traces of Nero's feasts remain, fragments of mosaic, the faint outline of frescoes that once glowed in lamplight. The scent of wine and roses is gone, but the idea lingers that in the end Rome itself became a reflection of its ruler. The city had learned to burn beautifully. When Nero's voice fell silent in the villa outside Rome, the empire exhaled, not in mourning but in confusion. His suicide ended more than a reign. It severed the long, unbroken thread of Julio-Claudian rule that had tied Rome's fortunes to one divine lineage. The marble halls that had once trembled under Nero's songs now stood still, their gold leaf dimming in the absence of command. The year was 68 CE, and for the first time in living memory, there was no clear air. Power, like wine left too long in an open amphora, began to sour. In the provinces, legions stirred. In Spain, Servius Sulpicius Galba, an old governor of ancient discipline, declared himself emperor. He was 73, austere, upright, and famously frugal. Tacitus would later describe him as worthy of empire, had he never ruled. The Senate, desperate for stability, supported him, while in the east, Vespasian quietly continued his campaign in Judea, watching and waiting. Galba's entry into Rome was solemn rather than triumphant. The people, weary from Nero's excesses, welcomed restraint, yet Galba's virtue soon revealed its sterility. He abolished Nero's lavish entertainments, cancelled public feasts, and refused to pay the donatives promised to the Praetorian Guard. The palace kitchens, once fragrant with honeyed wine and roasted pheasant, now produced meagre meals of boiled vegetables and salted fish. The empire's appetite was denied, and hunger, in Rome, was dangerous. At the emperor's sparse banquets, senators reclined uneasily on hard couches. Gone were the flowing wines and endless musicians. Galba preferred conversation over consumption, silence over spectacle. But power in Rome had always been theatrical. The people who once cheered Nero's burning gardens now whispered that Galba's cold virtue was another kind of cruelty. Ambition, meanwhile, simmered beneath the marble floors. Among Galba's supporters was Marcus Salvius Otho, once a companion and rival of Nero himself. Otho had lived a life of indulgence, known for his perfumes, his mirrors, and his easy charm. Nero had once banished him to Lusitania for marrying Poppaea Sabina, the woman Nero later took for himself. Now, Otho saw in Galba's age and unpopularity the perfect opportunity for return. In January 69 CE, Galba adopted a young noble named Piso Licinianus as his successor, not Otho. The decision sealed his fate. Days later, in the chill of a Roman dawn, the Praetorian Guard turned on their emperor. As Galba was carried through the forum on a litter, soldiers surrounded him. He offered his throat calmly, saying, "Strike, if it be for the good of Rome." His head was paraded through the streets on a pike, the thin lips still set in grim composure. Otho was hailed emperor. For a few brief weeks, the empire exhaled again. Otho sought reconciliation, restoring Nero's statues, granting amnesty, and returning warmth to the palace. Banquets resumed, though smaller, softer, a compromise between indulgence and memory. There were candles again, polished silver, modest music. For a moment, it seemed as though Rome might rediscover its rhythm. But news arrived from the north. In Germania, the legions had already proclaimed another emperor, Aulus Vitellius, governor of Lower Germany, a man whose appetite was legendary even by Roman standards. Vitellius, corpulent and genial, was beloved by his soldiers for his generosity and indulgence. His tables groaned under the weight of entire provinces' tribute: flamingos' tongues, lampreys, dormice stuffed with honey and poppy seed. He was, in many ways, Nero reborn, but without Nero's artistry or restraint. As his legions marched toward Italy, Otho faced a decision. He could delay, negotiate, or fight. He chose the last, though reluctantly. Tacitus describes him as melancholic in those final days, kind, anxious, almost gentle. Before the Battle of Bedriacum, he dined quietly with his officers, drinking little, speaking softly. There was no theatre, no performance. Perhaps he had learned from Nero that feasts could not stave off fate. Vitellius's forces won. When news of the defeat reached him, Otho retired to his tent, wrote a few letters, and took his own life. One of the rare moments of dignity in a year, otherwise drenched in chaos. The soldiers wept for him. Even Tacitus wrote of his death with quiet admiration. Rome, however, had little time to mourn. The empire was already shifting toward its next claimant. Vitellius entered the city in April, greeted by cheers that masked exhaustion. The people had seen emperors come and go in the span of months. The spectacle had become monotonous. But Vitellius promised pleasure, and pleasure was always welcome. The imperial kitchens roared back to life. He abolished Galba's austerity, and Otho's caution. The banquets of Nero returned, only more grotesque. Vitellius's daily meals were said to cost over 900,000 sesterces, a figure so vast it blurred into myth. He devoured entire courses of exotic delicacies, washed down with Falernian wine. He dined at all hours, in all places, even during processions. One chronicler described him falling asleep at the table, face down in a bowl of sauce, while slaves quietly replaced the dishes around him. The palace, once the heart of the empire, became a glutton's refuge. Affairs of state were left unattended. Messages went unread. The Senate drifted in uncertainty. Outside the walls, another claimant rose. Vespasian, the general from Judea, patient and calculating. As his legions marched west, famine and despair spread in Rome. The people who had once laughed through Nero's madness now fell silent under Vitellius's weight. In December 69 CE, Vespasian's troops entered the city. The final banquet of Vitellius was brief. Suetonius records that he hid in the palace, later dragged to the forum. He begged for mercy, but the mob, weary and hungry, showed none. He was killed near the Gemonian stairs, the same place where Sejanus, the fallen minister of Tiberius, had been cast decades earlier. And so, in 1 year, 4 emperors had risen and fallen. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally, Vespasian, each replacing the other like courses in a dark, endless meal. The banquet of empire had lost its flavor. What had once been a symbol of unity, power, and divine favor was now reduced to a grim ritual. The sharing of bread before betrayal, the lifting of cups before death. The marble halls still stood, the lamps still flickered, but the music had gone. Rome itself seemed to recline in exhaustion, fed to excess on its own ambition. Vespasian's arrival would bring a different kind of peace. Plain, steady, almost flavorless. But that too was what Rome needed. A cooling of the fire, a cleansing of the palate after too many poisoned feasts. When the blood had dried on the stones of the Forum, and the echoes of marching feet faded from the hills, Rome lay in a peculiar silence. The city, that had once burned for Nero and feasted for Vitellius, now seemed to hesitate between exhaustion and relief. The year of the 4 emperors had left it hollow, an empire fed to the point of nausea, an appetite dulled by too much power consumed too quickly. Into this quiet entered Titus Flavius Vespasianus, a man who neither looked nor acted like an emperor. He was 60 years old, broad-shouldered, plain-faced, the son of a tax collector. His hands were calloused from years of command, and his humor was coarse, the kind that found amusement in hardship. He had no divine lineage, no poet's voice, no taste for ceremony. His rule began not in celebration, but in restoration. Vespasian had spent much of his life in the army, dining not under gilded ceilings but beneath open skies. He had fought in Britannia, governed in Africa, and campaigned in Judea before Rome's chaos summoned him home. He knew the empire not as marble and myth, but as mud and rations. To him, leadership was not spectacle, it was endurance. When he entered the city in late 69 CE, he refused triumphal excess. The Domus Aurea, Nero's golden palace, he left unfinished. The vast banquet halls that Vitellius had filled with meats and perfumes now served as storerooms and barracks. Even his coronation feast was unremarkable, a modest affair of boiled cabbage, olives, and wine diluted with water. Those who attended found themselves uncertain whether to be grateful or disappointed, and yet, it was precisely this ordinariness that began to soothe the empire. Vespasian's banquets were simple, deliberately so. He dined early, avoided excess, and preferred conversation to entertainment. The dishes that appeared on his table would have seemed common in the home of any respectable Roman citizen: lentils, chickpeas, bread, and occasionally fish from the Tiber. He jested that he could govern an empire as cheaply as he could feed a legion. His humor, dry as the wine he drank, became legend. Once, when criticized for imposing a tax on public urinals, he held a coin to his nose and remarked, "Money does not smell." The phrase, pecunia non olet, would endure for centuries, outlasting the memory of grander emperors. Yet beneath this practical exterior, a residue of fear remained, an inheritance from the poisoned banquets of the Julio-Claudians. No emperor, however modest, could eat without awareness of what a meal might conceal. The empire remembered too well how figs had been smeared with death for Augustus, how mushrooms had silenced Claudius, how wine cups had carried whispers through generations, and so, even in simplicity, the table was watched. The imperial kitchens under Vespasian were staffed by men chosen for loyalty rather than skill. Slaves who prepared his food were chained not for punishment, but to prevent them from being bribed. The taster, once a ceremonial role, now held sacred importance. Each dish, even the plainest porridge, passed through scrutiny. The emperor ate slowly, carefully, never finishing a plate. His son Titus, who often dined with him, would later inherit both the caution and the humor. The philosopher Epictetus, a freedman during this reign, once reflected that wealth and poverty mattered little to a man who could master himself. In a sense, Vespasian ruled according to that same stoic measure. He sought not grandeur but stability, a Rome that could once again digest peace. His reforms were pragmatic, restoring the treasury drained by Nero and Vitellius, rebuilding the capital, and initiating the construction of the Flavian amphitheatre, later known as the Colosseum. That colossal structure, destined to host its own strange forms of feasting, games of blood and spectacle, rose from the ruins of Nero's artificial lake. It was an act of transformation, the turning of decadence into endurance. The evenings in Vespasian's Rome were quieter than they had been in decades. The scent of roasted meats no longer filled the streets. The musicians no longer played deep into the night. Instead, one could hear the faint rhythm of rebuilding, hammers, chisels, and the murmur of citizens returning to ordinary life. Vespasian's modest dinners became symbols of reassurance. Senators, long accustomed to performing deference amid danger, found in his table a strange comfort. He spoke little, laughed easily, and tolerated bluntness. The air around him was not heavy with perfume or fear, yet even then history's shadow lingered. For all his simplicity, Vespasian remained emperor, and emperors could never entirely escape the silent presence of mortality at their banquets. Tacitus notes that the fear of poison, though diminished, never vanished. Rome's elite had grown too used to suspicion, the shifting of a cup, the tremor of a servant's hand, the faint aftertaste of something unknown. Even in the calm, there was memory. When Vespasian's health began to falter in 79 CE, he faced it with the same bluntness he had brought to every feast. Stricken with fever, he refused to take to his bed, declaring that an emperor should die standing. On the morning of his death, he rose from his couch, attempted to rise, and collapsed. His final words, according to Suetonius, were a jest. "I think I am becoming a god." It was a joke at the expense of his deified predecessors, and perhaps the most human farewell an emperor had ever spoken. After his death, the empire passed to his son Titus, and Rome mourned sincerely, not for lost grandeur, but for the rare comfort of normalcy. Under Vespasian, the empire had rediscovered the quiet rhythm of stability, the measured pulse of daily bread and moderate wine. His reign had cleansed the palate of Rome's long intoxication, and yet, beneath the calm, something essential had changed. The banquet, once a mirror of empire's confidence, could never again be entirely innocent. Too many rulers had died with food still on their lips. The memory of poison, of suspicion, of whispered betrayals, had seeped into the marble of the dining halls themselves. Even in peace, the empire still ate with caution. After the long twilight of Vespasian and his sons, Rome drifted into a century of uneasy peace. The marble wounds of civil war had been plastered over, the great fires rebuilt, the festivals revived. Yet beneath the quiet surface, a fatigue deeper than politics lingered. The empire had learned restraint, but restraint has its own weight. By the 2nd century, the machinery of empire ran smoothly, almost impersonally, its rulers less gods than caretakers of an aging world. And then, amid this strange calm, came Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, the emperor who would rather have been a philosopher. His reign, beginning in 161 CE, arrived not with the sound of trumpets or banquets, but with the soft turning of a page. He was not a man of indulgence, nor even of comfort. He rose early, slept little, and preferred to eat as soldiers did, sparingly, without ceremony. Bread, cheese and olives, washed with a cup of diluted wine. His courtiers joked that the kitchens of the palace had grown bored under his rule. There was little to prepare, and nothing to fear. In an empire that had once dined on peacock and nightingale, this simplicity felt almost foreign. Marcus's table reflected his mind, ordered, modest, and self-contained. He reclined not to be served, but to think. In the dim evenings of the Palatine Hill, lamplight flickered against scrolls rather than golden cups. Servants moved softly, more like librarians than attendants. The hum of the city below, the chatter of taverns, the scent of roasted meat drifting up from the streets, felt distant, irrelevant. Where Nero had turned dining into theatre, Marcus turned it into contemplation. During his years on campaign along the Danube, even the modest comforts of Rome disappeared. His tent became his dining hall, his stool, his throne. He wrote much of his meditations there, surrounded by the crackle of campfires and the scent of damp earth. One can almost imagine him eating his ration of bread, pausing between bites to reflect. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. In his calm, there was both serenity and sorrow. For Marcus's reign, though remembered as the height of Rome's wisdom, was shadowed by constant war, plague, and loss. The empire he governed stretched from Britain to Syria, vast, weary, and increasingly fragile. The Antonine Plague, which swept through the empire in waves, filled the air with the scent of smoke and medicine, not feasts. Tables were set for families who did not return. The laughter that once echoed in Roman dining rooms was replaced by the sound of prayers and the creak of funeral carts. And yet, even as death crept quietly through the empire, the emperor's composure never faltered. In the evenings he continued his simple meals, often in the company of his generals. There was no music, no jesters, only quiet discussion, sometimes about philosophy, sometimes about supply lines. Food was sustenance, nothing more. The historian Cassius Dio wrote that Marcus ate as though nature had prescribed it, not desire. But perhaps what made his table most extraordinary was its lack of fear. For centuries, emperors had dined under invisible threat, poisoners, conspirators, treacherous kin. Yet Marcus's restraint disarmed those dangers. There was nothing in his life that others might covet, no glittering excess worth stealing. His humility was its own defense. Even his son Commodus, who would later drown himself in decadence, sat beside his father's plain plates and learned nothing from them. The philosopher-emperor did not hide behind walls or taster slaves. He spoke with soldiers, ate among them, and often shared their rations. It is said he refused delicacies sent from Rome, choosing instead the same coarse barley bread baked in camp ovens. To him, the empire was not a banquet to be devoured, but a duty to be endured. Still, there was a certain poetry in his austerity. When the winter nights stretched long along the northern frontier, the emperor's tent glowed faintly with oil lamps. The wind sighed across the Danubian plain, rustling the flaps of the tent like distant whispers. Inside, Marcus sat with his parchment, his food untouched, his thoughts turned inward. He wrote, "Do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you. While you live, while it is in your power, be good." The bread before him cooled, but he did not mind. The meal had never been about pleasure. In those moments, the empire, its borders, its banquets, its endless hunger, seemed to fade, leaving only a man and his thoughts. If Augustus had founded the empire, and Nero had set it aflame, Marcus Aurelius preserved it through understanding. His rule was not built on feasts or fear, but on the quiet acknowledgement of impermanence. When he returned to Rome, the city received him with reverence rather than celebration. His triumphs were modest, his processions restrained. He declined grand feasts, preferring public distributions of grain and oil. In the palace, his chambers remained undecorated. The silverware was plain, the goblets unengraved. But history, indifferent to virtue, continued its slow turning. In his final years, as illness spread again through the camps, Marcus's body weakened. His stomach could no longer bear heavy food. Even the simplest meals became burdensome. Yet he continued to eat among his men, his frail hands breaking bread that tasted of dust. On his last evening, in the camp at Vindobona, or Sirmium, depending on the account, he refused the elaborate dishes his servants brought. He asked instead for figs water and silence. The next morning, he died, calm, unafraid, his final breath a kind of prayer. The soldiers wept, for they knew that Rome had lost not just an emperor, but its last philosopher. In later centuries, his writings would survive, a collection of thoughts scribbled between battles, reflections composed between bites of humble bread. His meditations would become a companion to the weary and the thoughtful alike. Through them, the emperor's quiet voice endures, whispering across time to anyone who lies awake in the long hours before sleep. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be one. And so, the empire that had once consumed itself in gold and wine, now remembered an emperor who had eaten little, spoken softly, and understood everything. Rome's tables would never again be wholly innocent, but for a brief luminous moment under Marcus Aurelius, they were honest. After the calm passing of Marcus Aurelius, the empire woke as if from a long uneasy dream. The philosopher's breath had stilled, and in its place came a different rhythm, harsher, faster, hungrier. Commodus, his son, inherited a world that no longer knew how to sustain balance. The philosopher's bread turned to the gladiator's feast. Where once the emperor had pondered mortality, now the empire seemed determined to test it. And as the centuries advanced, Rome's tables changed with it. What had once been the theatre of virtue and temperance now grew heavy again with gilded plates, dark sauces, and whispered fear. The empire stretched, strained, and began to rot from within. Its rulers, courtiers, generals, and even scribes learned that a single goblet could decide the future more swiftly than an army. In this long twilight, from the age of Commodus through the crumbling centuries of the late empire, poison ceased to be the art of rumor. It became administration. The marble halls still glowed with lamplight, though the light fell on tired faces. Senators gathered not to debate, but to measure their words. Servants poured wine with lowered eyes. Eunuchs, once attendants, now acted as unseen couriers between factions, carrying letters, secrets, and sometimes powders folded neatly into linen packets. The air of Rome itself seemed cautious. The empire's power had become too vast, its heart too fragile. The more it divided, the more it whispered. By the 3rd century, with emperors rising and falling in the space of a few years, the sword was no longer the surest means of death. Armies were costly, daggers conspicuous, but a vial, a touch, a draught. These were economical, quiet, efficient. And so, poison took its place beside decree and tax, another tool of governance in an empire ruled increasingly by fear. Historians from the era, such as Herodian and Aurelius Victor, record this shift obliquely, noting sudden deaths, mysterious fevers, and the convenient timing of illness among rivals. Few ever wrote the word poison. They did not need to. Everyone understood. The banquet had always been the emperor's mirror. In the early centuries, it reflected confidence, vast platters, laughter, music. Under the Antonines, it showed restraint. But now, in the centuries of crisis, the banquet became something else entirely, a place where politics ate itself. At first, the victims were emperors. Commodus's own end came not at the blade of a soldier, but through the hand of Marcia, his concubine, who allegedly poisoned his wine after years of his growing instability. The pattern repeated: Caracalla, Elagabalus, Alexander Severus, all names followed by suspicion, by the faint scent of something added to the cup. Then the poison flowed downward. Provincial governors dined uneasily with local rivals. Generals who toasted one another in campaigns rarely both survived to return. Even the imperial household, once a symbol of divine protection, became a hive of calculated loyalty and secret revenge. Poisoners became professionals, men and women who understood chemistry better than philosophy, who sold invisibility to those who could pay. The ingredients themselves tell their own history. From the east came arsenic, traded in powder form under the name sandarak. From Egypt came hemlock, carefully preserved in oil. From the Greek Isles came aconite, the monk's bane, and from the far provinces, Gaul, Numidia and beyond, came stranger tinctures made from snake venom and crushed toadstones. The recipes circulated like state secrets. The difference between a physician and an assassin was sometimes only a contract. The historian Pliny the Elder, writing earlier in the empire, had already warned of such substances, their allure, their silence. But by the time of Diocletian, the line between medicine and murder was blurred beyond recovery. Alchemists and apothecaries worked in the same quarters, their workshops filled with brass bowls, mortars and drying herbs. The same shelves that held healing salves also housed death. The more the empire centralized, the less visible its violence became. It is said that in Constantinople, long after the capital shifted eastward, the eunuchs of the imperial court mastered the use of poison, not for rebellion, but for maintenance. A troublesome general, a proud governor, a cousin with too much ambition, the kitchen would attend to it. It was not cruelty, it was policy. One might imagine the banquets of this later empire, the candlelight dimmer now, the laughter forced, gilded dishes gleam, yet no one eats first. The emperor raises his cup, and dozens of eyes follow, uncertain. Somewhere, far from the tables, an apothecary closes his shutters. The city outside hums with life, unaware that history is being rewritten with every swallow of wine. Poison was not merely death, it was the illusion of control. In a state where loyalty could never be trusted, where armies might betray an emperor by dawn, poison offered precision. It was the whisper that replaced the war cry, the pen that replaced the sword. Over the next century, through the reigns of emperors like Constantine, Constantius and Julian, poison persisted, less as panic, more as bureaucracy. It had become the empire's unspoken punctuation mark, a way to conclude inconvenient sentences. When the court moved east, the tradition followed. The Byzantine chronicles, written centuries later, still record quiet deaths over banquets, emperors struck down by wine or by bread, their bodies cold before the torches dimmed. Yet by then, the act no longer shocked anyone. It had become as Roman as the feast itself. The empire, once founded on the sword, had learned to govern through the cup, and so, as the marble of Rome cracked, and the legions thinned, and the West began to fade into myth, the poisoners remained, invisible heirs to centuries of fear. They were the archivists of paranoia, the quiet accountants of power's decay. Every empire, it seemed, learned in time that the deadliest wars are fought not on the field, but at the table. By the 5th century, the Roman banquet was no longer the grand theatre of the gods. It was a small trembling ceremony performed in half-lit rooms by men who no longer believed in eternity. The empire's appetite had finally turned inward, and as the lamps burned lower, the historians who came after, Ammianus, Zosimus, Procopius, looked back at the long feast of Rome and found only one lingering taste: the bitterness of wine that had never been trusted. The death of Marcus Aurelius left behind more than an empire. It left a silence too profound for his successor to bear. Into that silence stepped Commodus, a son untempered by reflection, a man born into marble but lacking the patience to understand its weight. Where his father's meals had been quiet meditations, Commodus's table became theatre, not of thought, but of appetite. In the early days of his reign, Rome exhaled, the philosopher was gone, and with him went restraint. The city, weary of austerity, wanted laughter again, feasts again, indulgence without consequence. Commodus obliged. At first his banquets echoed the old traditions, reclining couches draped in purple, silver platters gleaming with roasted birds, music floating between marble columns. But as the months turned to years, something darker began to seep into the edges of the light. The feasts grew louder, the dishes more extravagant, and the laughter less human. Commodus delighted in abundance, not for its taste, but for its symbolism. He had inherited a world that had tried too long to discipline itself. He sought instead to undo it. At his table, luxury became domination. Food was not to be shared but conquered. It is said that he ordered entire courses made from exotic animals, ostrich tongues, flamingo brains, even roasted lions, served not for flavor, but for spectacle. Each meal became an act of imperial excess, a small conquest of nature itself. The chroniclers Cassius Dio and Herodian record his fondness for performance. Commodus fancied himself a living god, Hercules reborn, and every meal was a ritual reaffirming that delusion. The palace's great dining hall, the triclinium Mardius, transformed under his rule. Marble walls glowed with torchlight reflected in golden bowls. Slaves sprinkled saffron-scented water across the floor to cool the air. Musicians played endlessly, their fingers blistered from the strings, yet beneath the glow, something rancid stirred. The emperor had begun to blur the line between feasting and killing. At times the entertainments during his dinners involved not jesters or dancers, but death itself. Slaves or condemned criminals were forced to fight wild animals in pits dug near the banquet floor, so that the guests might dine to the rhythm of screams and applause. The emperor, reclining on his couch, would watch intently, sometimes pausing to eat a fig or sip wine as blood stained the sand. What poison could compare to that? In Commodus's Rome the toxin was not in the cup, it was in the air. The empire had begun to rot inwardly, its rituals hollow, its ceremonies monstrous parodies of former grandeur. The philosopher's stoic peace had curdled into madness. Even the senators, once proud guardians of tradition, attended his banquets in trembling silence. They toasted his name, praised his dishes, and prayed to survive the evening. It is said that Commodus enjoyed toying with the idea of death at the table. He would invite nobles to dine beside him, offering them wine with an ambiguous smile, waiting just long enough for the fear to show in their eyes before drinking first himself, proving for that moment that the emperor controlled both pleasure and mortality. In such an atmosphere, poison seemed almost obsolete. The emperor's moods were poison enough. Cassius Dio tells of an evening when Commodus, dressed as Hercules, presided over a feast served entirely in gold dishes. Between courses, he had servants bring the severed heads of ostriches, a reminder of the fates of those who displeased him. He laughed as senators forced themselves to eat, too frightened to leave, too proud to weep. Even the food began to lose its meaning. The kitchens of the Palatine became laboratories of absurdity. Cooks ordered to invent new forms of decadence, loaves dyed purple with crushed berries, soups thickened with ground pearls, meats gilded with actual gold leaf. Commodus's appetite had little to do with hunger. It was theatre, one long, gluttonous assertion that the empire existed only to feed him. And yet, beneath the noise, Rome was starving. Beyond the palace walls, the streets grew rougher, the markets emptier. The plague that had haunted Marcus's campaigns still lingered, flaring up in the poorer quarters. The treasury shrank while the feasts swelled. The people who once toasted their philosopher emperor now whispered that the gods had turned away. Commodus didn't notice. He dined each night surrounded by mirrors, literal and political. The walls reflected his image endlessly. and his courtiers did the same. Every gesture of pleasure was imitated, every taste praised. But even within that hall of reflection, paranoia crept in. Perhaps he remembered his father's warnings, or perhaps he simply understood power too well, that the knife and the cup were always near. He began to trust no one. Food tasters were doubled, then tripled. Servants rotated nightly, so no one could predict who would serve next. Some sources claim he forced guests to eat before he did, watching their expressions closely. He was not wrong to be afraid, for even amid his cruelty, his own death was already being prepared in the shadows. By the year 192 CE, Commodus's reign had become unbearable even to those who profited from it. His mistress, Marcia, his chamberlain, Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect Latus conspired together. Poison, once redundant, returned to the table one final time. On the last evening of December, Commodus dined as usual, confident, perhaps, that the world remained his reflection. The cup brought to him, warm, spiced, and sweet, carried death so subtly that he might have smiled after drinking it. Some accounts say it failed, that he vomited and raged, only to be strangled later in his bath. Others suggest that the poison worked cleanly, its silence as complete as his father's once was. However it happened, the empire seemed to exhale again. When the servants cleared the dishes, there was no applause, no lament, only the faint scent of spiced wine lingered. And so ended the emperor who had turned the Roman table into a theatre of death. His reign revealed what centuries of ambition had concealed, that the banquet, once a symbol of Rome's abundance, had become the stage of its moral collapse. In Commodus's world, the poison was no longer a substance, it was the system itself. After his death, the senators declared him an enemy of the state, his statues destroyed, his name erased, but the memory of his feasts lingered, grotesque, glittering, unforgettable. Even in the centuries to come, when new emperors would rise and dine, they would inherit not just his throne, but the shadow of his appetite. The marble floors of the palace, polished nightly, still carried faint stains no servant could scrub away. Rome had feasted on itself. The body of Rome, already weakened by centuries of indulgence and betrayal, began to divide under its own weight. What had once been one vast and trembling empire, fractured into two minds, the western half fading toward ruin, and the eastern half glimmering with a different kind of endurance. The marble cracked, but the mosaic gleamed. In the late 4th century, the world of emperors and feasts took on a new complexion. The barbarian invasions to the west had stripped the old cities bare. In Rome itself, weeds grew between the paving stones of abandoned forums. Yet, far to the east on the shores of the Bosporus, another light began to rise, colder, sharper, more deliberate. Here stood Constantinople, the new Rome, founded by Constantine the Great, and crowned by emperors who inherited not the vigor of conquest, but the reflex of suspicion. The age of the banquet did not die, it evolved. Where the old feasts of the Caesars had celebrated power through abundance, the new Byzantine tables celebrated it through intricacy. The dishes were no less grand, peacocks still roasted, honeyed wine still flowed, but every act of dining became ceremonial, codified, careful. Etiquette replaced ecstasy. The empire, having learned the price of indulgence, now treated its own appetite with reverence and fear. The emperor sat not as a reveler, but as a god enthroned. He was surrounded by layers of ritual, layers of rank, layers of defense. Even the meals reflected this geometry. Dishes arrived in patterns, fish from the Bosporus, fruits from Syria, pastries from Egypt, each placed with mathematical precision. Servants moved in silence, their steps measured, their glances downcast. It was beauty in the service of paranoia. The feasts of the Byzantine emperors, described in detail by chroniclers like Constantine VII's Porphyrogenitos in De Ceremonies, read less like meals and more like liturgies. Every motion was rehearsed. Even the tasting of the emperor's food became an act of state. The Praepositus Sacri Cubiculi, the great chamberlain, oversaw the dishes, ensuring that no hand touched them unsanctioned. The cupbearers, chosen from the eunuchs of the palace, lived under constant scrutiny. A single mistake could mean death. Gone were the days of laughter at the table. Instead, there was composure, the soft rustle of silk robes, the faint chiming of gold cutlery, the whisper of courtiers, bowing as dishes were served. In the corners of these glittering halls stood guards, always present, never eating. It was said that the emperor's meals were so closely monitored that even the number of figs or grapes on his plate was recorded by scribes. Beneath this choreography, however, lay the same old dread that the cup might be poisoned, that a trusted servant might be an assassin, that death, now draped in gold and incense, would still find its way to the imperial table, and it often did. The annals of Byzantium are lined with quiet, inexplicable deaths. Emperor Leo VI, assassinated during Christmas service. Michael III, cut down by his own guard after a night of drinking. Romanus II, who died suddenly after a feast, amid whispers of poisoned wine. Each death, though often attributed to divine will or sudden illness, bore the familiar scent of suspicion. The empire had refined poison into a language, subtle, elegant, deniable. The Byzantines were masters of continuity. Where Rome had burned its own grandeur, they preserved it under layers of ceremony. The marble of Constantinople's palaces gleamed white under oil lamps, the air thick with the scent of rosewater and myrrh. Banquets could last for hours, even days, their rhythm slow and hypnotic, but the splendor concealed a hollowness. The guests, courtiers, and foreign envoys who reclined along the silk-draped couches ate cautiously, their eyes flicking from dish to dish. Food was abundant but untrusted. Wine was poured but rarely finished. The empire had perfected the art of beauty as defense, the illusion of serenity hiding the constant hum of danger beneath. The servants themselves, most of them eunuchs, were chosen for their loyalty and perceived harmlessness, but even that could not erase fear. Many emperors demanded multiple tasters, each testing a small portion of every dish. In time it became less about detection and more about ritual, a symbolic act to appease the paranoia that ruled the palace. And yet, even within that gilded caution, there was genius. The Byzantium's fear became its architecture, its suspicion built walls, its anxiety bred endurance. The empire survived what Rome could not, because it expected betrayal as a condition of existence. Every feast was both nourishment and test, of loyalty, of hierarchy, of control. Even art reflected it. Mosaics depicting Christ Pantocrator gazed down from golden domes onto tables set in symmetrical perfection. The divine order mirrored the imperial. To dine in Constantinople was to enact a sacred performance of civilization itself, a civilization that understood that beauty could coexist with fear, and that perhaps beauty was born from it. Over time, the poisoners themselves became invisible, absorbed into the machinery of court life. Byzantium no longer needed individuals like Livia or Agrippina. The system was enough. It was a palace of whispers where an emperor might die in his sleep, a servant vanish, a new dynasty emerge, all without a single cry. As centuries passed, the Byzantine feast grew colder, the silver dulled, the rituals ossified. What had once been suspicion became habit. What had once been dread became ceremony. Yet still, at every table, the same question lingered unspoken: who among us will eat tomorrow? When the Crusaders finally breached the city in 1204, they found not a city of debauchery, but of ghosts, a civilization so encased in formality that its pulse was nearly undetectable. The feasts they discovered in the great palace were remnants, relics of a grandeur that had long since ceased to nourish, and yet, even as the empire withered, its shadow lingered, in Europe's courts, in the etiquette of kings, in the measured grace of diplomacy. Byzantium's suspicion became Europe's sophistication. The fork, the napkin, the tasting of wine, all carried whispers of the old dread, inherited from marble and mosaic. Byzantium did not end the story of Rome's poisoned banquets. It preserved it, embalmed in ceremony, wrapped in silk, perfumed with myrrh. The empire had learned to live with its poison, as one learns to live with memory. By the late medieval centuries, as the echoes of Byzantium faded into the dawn of Renaissance Europe, the lessons of Rome and Constantinople endured. Courts in Florence, Venice, and later France had absorbed not only the grandeur of imperial dining, but also its pervasive caution. Every feast, every goblet, every gilded plate carried the memory of emperors who had dined with death at their side. And so, the art of prevention grew elaborate, ritualized, and endlessly meticulous. It began quietly, in the shadowed corners of kitchens and antechambers. A single cup of wine, a morsel of meat, could decide the fate of a duchy, a kingdom, or an entire dynasty. The methods of suspicion were inherited from centuries of careful observation. What the Romans had left in fear, the Byzantines had refined into ceremony. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Europe's nobility adopted these measures with almost religious precision. The taster, once a casual role in Rome, became an institutional necessity. In Florence, the Medici employed servants whose sole responsibility was to sample the food before the ruler ever touched it. Each dish, each drink, was presented first to these tasters, who would chew, sip, and then wait. Should they show signs of illness, the meal was discarded, and whispers of danger spread quietly through the kitchen. Yet, the taster's presence was both a comfort and a curse. On one hand, they were a visible line of defense, a small guarantee against treachery. On the other, their existence reminded everyone that the poisoner was always imagined, lurking, patient, invisible. To dine with a taster was to confront mortality before each bite. Even when the taster survived, their vigilance was a constant silent accusation. One could die at this table tomorrow, or the day after. Silver became another instrument in this slow dance with mortality. It was believed that certain metals could react with toxins, turning black or staining when in contact with deadly substances. Goblets, spoons, knives, all were crafted with the possibility of treachery in mind. Gold, though resplendent, was thought unreliable. Copper, lead, and even pewter were often avoided, for they could hide the smallest chemical transformation. The utensils themselves became detectors, their shine a fragile reassurance that was never complete. And yet, even these measures only deepened unease. The very act of testing implied danger, and the more precautions one took, the heavier the weight of suspicion grew. Courtiers, already attuned to the subtleties of rank, began to scrutinize one another. Every smile, every handshake, every shared morsel became a cipher. Who might be observing the reaction of the silver? Who might be watching the taster's expression? The meal transformed from nourishment into examination, from pleasure into anxiety. Recipes were altered not merely for taste but for security. Spices, once sought for their aroma and luxury, were now also chosen for their perceived capacity to mask toxins or to prevent them from being absorbed quickly. Herbs like rue, sage, and parsley were sprinkled into sauces not only for flavor but for protection, their bitterness a reminder of the empire's inherited dread. Wine might be diluted with water, milk, or vinegar, partly to maintain palate but partly to hinder any poison from acting immediately. In the palaces of Venice, ambassadors from distant courts observed these precautions with awe and unease. The intricate choreography of the table, dishes presented in precise order, tasters evaluating silently, silver utensils glinting with the promise of safety, created a kind of ritual theater. But the actors in this theater were not merely cooks and waiters, they were diplomats, spies, and even assassins, all moving under the same roof. A single error could turn ceremony into catastrophe. The practice of tasting was not limited to the elite. In some regions, local rulers employed entire kitchens of test tasters, each trained in subtle signs of poisoning, dizziness, pallor, nausea, faint tremors. Yet even when these signs appeared, interpretation remained uncertain. Illness could come from natural causes. The taster could exaggerate or misread the symptoms. And so the test, meant to guarantee safety, also introduced layers of ambiguity, prolonging anxiety rather than alleviating it. The silver itself was a paradox. Beautiful, reflective, and seemingly pure, it carried within its gleam a constant question: is it safe to eat? Spoons and goblets were polished not only for appearance but for assurance. Their tarnish became a silent language. blackened edges, pitted surfaces, signaling the potential presence of poison. But over time, the constant attention to silver and utensils produced a subtle paranoia, an endless questioning of every shimmer and reflection. Even the most confident noble could not escape the knowledge that their life depended on metal, taste, and vigilance. Meals became rehearsed performances. Guests reclined in order of rank, each aware that the slightest misstep could be fatal. Servants passed plates with exacting care, their movements choreographed as though every gesture might reveal treachery. Conversation moved slowly, punctuated by careful sips of wine. The architecture of dining halls, long tables, high ceilings, intricate tapestries, contributed to the impression that the room itself was a sanctuary of vigilance, as if the walls listened and the floors reported any movement. Yet, the ritual never eliminated fear. In fact, it magnified it. The taster's survival, the untarnished silver, the herbs and antidotes, all were partial protections, not guarantees. Courtiers and rulers learned to live in the presence of doubt. The very abundance of preparation underscored the potential for disaster. Eating became not a pleasure, but an acknowledgement of the unseen, that poison could be anywhere, that betrayal was inevitable, that even beauty and ritual could not protect the human body from the ambitions and resentments of others. Over centuries, the art of testing food, the study of utensils, and the careful use of herbs and antidotes became codified into manuals, treatises, and courtly etiquette. These writings, often circulated in secret, instructed nobles in every aspect of cautious dining. Some included lists of known poisons and their symptoms, others offered recipes for antidotes that could be administered quickly. The lessons of Rome, Byzantium, and medieval courts were distilled into knowledge, and yet that knowledge carried its own weight, the constant reminder that death might arrive disguised as a meal. Even as Europe moved toward the Renaissance, with its celebrations of art, learning, and discovery, the poisoned legacy of the past persisted. The silver spoon gleamed on dining tables of Florence and Venice, not merely as an object of luxury, but as a testament to survival, a quiet acknowledgement that the cup might be deadly, the bread might betray, and that vigilance must accompany indulgence. Thus, the table became a paradox, at once magnificent and menacing, a place of ritualized grace and omnipresent dread. Each bite was both sustenance and caution, each sip both pleasure and test. By the careful choreography of tasters, silver, herbs, and antidotes, Europe preserved a tradition inherited from the empires of old, a tradition in which the shadow of poison lingered, as long as the light of civilization itself. The legacy of Rome and Byzantium, carried forward by those meticulous precautions, would endure for centuries. The silver spoons, the tasters, and the antidotes were not merely instruments of safety, they were symbols, reminders that the power to nourish was inseparable from the power to destroy, and that every banquet was a negotiation with mortality itself. In the delicate dance of imperial dining, fear was both the silent conductor and the music itself. Across centuries and empires, from Rome's golden halls to Byzantium's candlelit palaces, and later to the flourishing courts of Renaissance Europe, the act of eating became a stage for the mind as much as for the body. The psychology of fear, cultivated through generations of whispered deaths, poisoned cups, and the omnipresent possibility of betrayal, reshaped behavior, architecture, and even cuisine itself. By the time European courts had matured into elaborate ceremonial centers, the individual at the center, the monarch, emperor, or prince, had learned that every bite, every sip, every conversation at the table carried weight far beyond the immediate pleasure of dining. Emperors, recalling the stories of Augustus, Claudius, Commodus, and Byzantine predecessors, began to approach meals as if they were tests of loyalty, endurance, and perception. Many ate alone, seated apart from their courtiers, accompanied only by the select few whose loyalty had been tested through years of observation and ceremonial trial. To share a table was to risk exposure to ambition, envy, and subtle malice. The courtiers, in turn, adapted their behavior in ways that became ritualized. Hunger itself became a performance, Some would appear eager for the emperor's favor by tasting slowly, savoring with exaggerated attention, or pretending to eat delicately to indicate deference. Others feigned satisfaction while concealing caution, aware that the emperor's gaze might judge not merely appetite but intent. In this theater of suspicion, every gesture, glance or cough could be misinterpreted as a sign of plotting or weakness. Kitchens and service corridors were no longer simple spaces of preparation. They became arenas of surveillance and strategy. Chefs and stewards were selected not only for culinary skill, but also for psychological resilience. They had to maintain composure under scrutiny, navigating the delicate task of preparing meals that could sustain and delight, yet remain uncontaminated. The presence of food tasters, as discussed in the preceding chapter, was both a safety measure and a subtle reinforcement of fear. Diners were reminded constantly that their lives could depend on the reactions of another human being. Even the architecture of dining spaces reflected this heightened state of alertness. Tables were often arranged to limit concealment, corridors to facilitate observation, and lighting to allow the ruler to see expressions clearly. The layout itself became a psychological tool, a reminder that every movement, every decision, and every morsel of food was being scrutinized. Mirrors, tapestries, and polished metals amplified this effect, offering reflections that were as much about control as about aesthetics. The psychological impact of such constant vigilance was profound. Emperors and monarchs, accustomed to being surrounded by advisors, guards, and attendants, often found themselves isolated by their own authority. To sit alone at a feast was to assert power, but also to internalize fear. Meals could last hours, and during this time, rulers reflected not only on policy, but also on potential threats, calculating the loyalty of those who had passed the threshold of their table. Similarly, courtiers and servants internalized a perpetual state of anxiety. They learned to speak carefully, move cautiously, and even eat in ways that communicated loyalty without revealing too much of their own temperament. In this environment, the act of eating was transformed into an intricate choreography of observation, interpretation, and subtle signaling. What might appear to an outsider as opulent leisure was, in fact, a continuous negotiation with danger and mortality. Psychologically, fear also created a feedback loop. The more elaborate the precautions, tasters, silver utensils, antidotes, secret passages, the more the participants were reminded of the omnipresent threat. Fear became habit, and habit became ritual. Over time, the experience of dining came to embody a form of social conditioning. Individuals learned to mask instinct, to calibrate expressions, and to anticipate risk with every sensory detail. This subtle tension, maintained over generations, contributed to the enduring reputation of imperial courts as places of both beauty and dread. Historical accounts illustrate the extremes of this psychological conditioning. Emperor Justinian of Byzantium, for instance, is described as consuming meals under strict observation, often accompanied only by trusted advisors, and sometimes isolating himself completely to avoid the risk of tampering. Louis XIV of France, centuries later, would insist on elaborate ceremonies surrounding his meals, where courtiers had to participate in rehearsed roles that emphasized both their proximity to and distance from the king. Even minor errors could be interpreted as disloyalty or audacity, and the specter of suspicion permeated every movement. Fear also reshaped culinary choices. Spices, textures, and preparation methods were selected not only for taste, but for perceived safety. Certain ingredients, like saffron or cloves, were believed to mask or counteract poisons, while the timing and sequence of courses were designed to minimize risk. Every cup, every morsel, was simultaneously nourishment and negotiation with potential threats, a testament to the psychological complexity that governed life at court. By the time Renaissance Europe had fully embraced courtly sophistication, the psychological mechanisms established in Rome and Byzantium had become institutionalized. Dining rooms were as much classrooms in vigilance as they were venues for pleasure. Etiquette manuals instructed nobles on posture, pace, and gaze, emphasizing subtle cues of loyalty, submission, and attentiveness. Children of the nobility were educated in this theatre of observation from a young age, learning that survival often depended on mastering both the external rituals of dining and the internal calculus of fear, and yet for all its oppressive weight, fear was productive. It reinforced hierarchy, clarified allegiance, and preserved stability in societies otherwise prone to intrigue and assassination. The emperor who dined alone was secure. The taster's careful evaluation provided both protection and performance. The silver spoon, reflecting light and vigilance, became an instrument of psychological reinforcement. The enduring lesson of the imperial court, transmitted through centuries of observation and adaptation, was clear: power and fear are inseparable at the table. Authority is magnified through ritual and isolation, while subordinates are conditioned to perform loyalty through subtle gestures. The banquet itself becomes an arena of psychological mastery, where every flavor, aroma, and movement carries symbolic weight. In such an environment, eating is no longer a simple act of sustenance. It becomes a negotiation with mortality, a rehearsal of authority, and a demonstration of the subtle ways that fear shapes human behavior. The legacy of Roman poisoners, Byzantine ceremonials, and Renaissance ritualists is evident, even as courts grew more elegant and sophisticated. The shadow of suspicion never fully lifted, ensuring that each meal remained a delicate balance between pleasure, power, and paranoia. The banquet is no longer merely a feast. It is a theatre of mind, a mirror of anxiety, and a reminder that survival in the corridors of power often depends as much on perception and restraint as on the bite of a blade or the sip of a poisoned cup. In the dimly lit chambers of Rome, Byzantium, and later the courts of Renaissance Europe, the relationship between opulence and mortality revealed itself not only in politics and psychology, but also in the delicate, often macabre realm of medical knowledge. As emperors and nobles reclined upon velvet cushions, surrounded by dishes glimmering with gold and exotic spices, their physicians pondered the same fundamental question: how to sustain life in the face of human ingenuity's deadliest inventions. Poison, long the invisible companion of courtly ambition, became a field of study as much as a fear. The science of death, intertwined with luxury, reflected the paradox of civilizations that both revered abundance and anticipated betrayal. Roman medicine, drawing from Greek traditions, had developed a framework for understanding toxins, though it remained rudimentary by modern standards. The famed physician Dioscorides catalogued plants, minerals, and animal products that could harm or heal, noting their effects with precision and caution. Hemlock, aconite, nightshade, and various heavy metals were described with both reverence and trepidation. Recipes for antidotes, often combining herbal compounds with mechanical techniques such as inducing vomiting, were disseminated not merely for treatment, but for the reassurance of rulers and their households. In imperial kitchens, a herb like rue or a slice of raw fig could function as both garnish and precaution, blurring the line between culinary delight and prophylactic intervention. Physicians accompanying emperors carried tools and substances for immediate intervention. The vomit-inducing pot, sometimes a simple brass vessel, sometimes a porcelain cup, was a standard feature of palace medicine. Small doses of charcoal, milk, or wine mixed with herbs were administered as prophylactics, meant to neutralize toxins or accelerate expulsion. The act itself, though clinical, carried psychological weight. It reinforced vigilance, underscored the omnipresence of threat, and perpetuated a culture in which even pleasure could not be divorced from fear. Yet, for all its caution, Roman science was entwined with paradox. The very same ports that brought lethal herbs to the tables of emperors also delivered the spices and delicacies that defined imperial luxury. Cinnamon, pepper, saffron, and exotic fruits arrived from lands as distant as India and Arabia. These imports, intended to signify prestige and sophistication, sometimes carried the very toxins that physicians sought to counteract. A carefully spiced dish could delight the palate while imperiling the body, and a rare ingredient might function as either a feast or a fatal trap depending on preparation and intention. The irony extended further. Rome's wealth, cultivated through conquest and trade, ensured that the elite were simultaneously nourished and endangered by the empire's abundance. Luxury was inseparable from risk. Pearls dissolved in vinegar, flamingo tongues, and wine flavored with Eastern spices could impress a guest, distract a political rival, or mask the presence of a toxic substance. Even the most sophisticated antidotes could not completely negate the inherent danger in these imported delicacies. Every sumptuous morsel carried with it the faintest whisper of mortality, and every sip of wine could harbor both pleasure and peril. Physicians of the time also recognized the necessity of observation and diagnosis. Symptoms of poisoning were catalogued with meticulous attention: nausea, pallor, dizziness, convulsions, yet interpretation remained challenging. Many illnesses, including fevers, digestive disorders, and infections, mimicked the effects of toxins. Thus, medical practice at the imperial table involved both science and art, a blend of empirical observation and cautious speculation. The physician became both healer and detective, employing remedies that were as symbolic as they were therapeutic. In the later centuries of Byzantium and Renaissance Europe, the science of antidotes grew increasingly sophisticated. Texts like Apicius de Re Coquinaria and subsequent herbal treatises combined culinary knowledge with medical precaution, offering recipes that balanced flavor with safety. Spices that had once been mere ornamentation were now chosen for their potential to counteract known poisons. Preparations involved exact measurements, timings and sequences, a careful choreography aimed at preserving life without sacrificing the grandeur expected by rulers and their courts. This fusion of luxury and caution extended beyond the palace kitchens into the very experience of dining. Wine, often the medium through which toxins could be delivered, was served in measured quantities and tasted first by attendants. Fruits and meats were examined for freshness, texture and aroma, not only for culinary quality, but for safety. Even the act of reclining, a hallmark of Roman dining, served a subtle medical purpose. A relaxed posture facilitated digestion and allowed physicians to monitor physiological reactions discreetly. Yet, despite all these measures, the tension between opulence and danger persisted. The emperor's table remained a locus where the finest luxuries coexisted with the most intimate threats. A banquet could celebrate victory, cement alliances, or display cultural sophistication, but it always carried the undercurrent of risk. Physicians were vigilant, tasters cautious, and utensils scrutinized, yet the luxury that defined power was inseparable from the potential for catastrophe. In essence, the science of death and the taste of luxury were two threads woven into the same tapestry. The careful study of poisons, antidotes, and symptoms reflected a civilization's understanding of vulnerability, while the sumptuousness of the imperial table reflected its capacity for indulgence. Together they created a continuum where pleasure and peril were inseparable, where every culinary innovation was shadowed by awareness of mortality, and where wealth itself became a medium for both nourishment and threat. By the time Venice and Florence reached their height, this duality had crystallized. Merchants and courtiers alike understood that exotic imports could enrich the palate and imperil the body. Chefs were skilled not only in taste but in detection. Physicians walked the halls with herbs, cups, and small instruments. Their knowledge derived from centuries of Roman experimentation, Byzantine refinement, and Renaissance observation. Dining was simultaneously an exercise in artistry, psychology, and survival. Thus, the legacy of Rome's poisoned banquets extended beyond political intrigue and assassination. It shaped medical practice, culinary arts, and social ritual. Luxury without vigilance was dangerous. Vigilance without sophistication was humiliating. The emperor, the court, and even the physician became participants in a delicate negotiation with mortality, a negotiation expressed through herbs, spices, silver, and carefully prepared dishes. Every feast was simultaneously a celebration of abundance and a subtle confrontation with death, reminding all who dined that pleasure and peril are inseparable companions at the table of power. In the end, Rome's wealth had taught a bitter lesson. The very things that demonstrated status, sophistication, and refinement, the imported spices, rare delicacies, and intricate recipes, were also vectors of danger. The science of poison and the taste of luxury were never separate, but entwined, ensuring that the act of dining remained a mirror of empire itself, magnificent, intricate, and always on the edge of catastrophe. As centuries turned and empires waned, the grandiosity of imperial banquets began to diminish, yet the shadow they cast lingered long after the tables were cleared. Or what had once been literal, the silken cup potentially laced with aconite, or the figs subtly smeared with hemlock, evolved into metaphor, into a language of caution, reflection, and moral reckoning. The banquet, a space that had defined power, ritual, and indulgence, now became a symbol of broader human vulnerabilities. The seductions of greed, the fragility of trust, and the silent corrosion of civility beneath gilded surfaces. By the late Byzantine era and into Renaissance Europe, the literal fear of poison persisted, but became intertwined with literary, philosophical, and social conceptions of corruption. Chroniclers and poets began to depict the act of dining as a microcosm of society itself, the table representing hierarchy, the food symbolizing resources, and the potential for poisoning mirroring the susceptibility of virtue to temptation. The same empires that had trained their rulers to suspect every morsel also taught observers to understand that opulence could blind judgment, and indulgence could erode prudence. In the waning days of the Roman Empire, political instability and economic strain altered the nature of feasts. Once resplendent with exotic imports and architectural grandeur, dining tables became smaller, less ceremonial, and more pragmatic. Yet, even as the luxury faded, the symbolic weight of poison remained. It was not merely a tool for assassination, but a representation of the subtle encroachments of ambition, envy, and duplicity. A poisoned chalice was more than a threat to life. It was an emblem of the moral decay that accompanies concentrated power. The metaphor extended into literature, art, and philosophy. In Renaissance Italy, writers such as Baldassare Castiglione in the Book of the Courtier reflected on the delicate manners of dining, emphasizing that every action, gesture, and word carried significance beyond immediate perception. Poison became allegorical, an invisible reminder that excess could corrupt not only the body but the spirit, that indulgence could weaken judgment, and that civility could crumble quietly beneath the surface of elegance. The banquet was no longer merely a social ritual, it was a reflection on human nature, a moral laboratory where the temptations of luxury and authority were made tangible. Even in the courts of France and England, the imagery of poison permeated political discourse. Monarchs were advised to be wary of flattering courtiers, to scrutinize gifts, and to consider the intentions behind every invitation to dine. Banquets became performances in vigilance as much as in grandeur. The table itself was a mirror of society, each plate representing opportunity, each cup illustrating risk, and each gesture of etiquette a safeguard against the slow erosion of loyalty and morality. At the symbolic level, poison represented the inevitability of corruption. Just as the smallest dose could end a life, the subtle manipulations of ambition could dismantle relationships, destabilize governments, and erode communal trust. The decadence of the feast mirrored the decadence of empire. The overindulgence of rulers reflected the widening gap between elite and populace. Poison, once a literal agent of death, now illustrated the slow, quiet collapse of civility under opulence, and the insidious consequences of unchecked desire. By the time the Renaissance matured and the age of reason approached, the banquet had transformed further. It remained a social and political stage, but it was no longer defined solely by the fear of death by ingestion. Instead, the legacy of centuries of literal poison had evolved into a cultural metaphor. Writers, philosophers, and artists portrayed it as a representation of moral vigilance, cautionary indulgence, and the perils inherent in power. The poisoner was no longer just a kitchen figure or a court spy. They became an abstract force, representing envy, betrayal, ambition, and the slow rot of ethical decay. Art reflected this allegorical evolution. Paintings of lavish feasts, once simply celebratory, began to include subtle visual cues of danger, spilled wine hinting at vulnerability, overturned utensils suggesting disorder, and figures in shadows representing concealed threat. Literature echoed these themes, exploring the psychological landscapes of fear, suspicion, and moral consequence. The symbolic banquet emphasized that the collapse of civility often preceded the collapse of kingdoms, that indulgence without restraint carried costs, and that power, like poison, could be as destructive when invisible as when overt. Thus, the end of the feast was not merely chronological but philosophical. The literal threat of poison, so central to Rome, Byzantium, and Renaissance courts, gave way to a more enduring legacy, the recognition that human societies are constantly negotiating with their own appetites, fears, and ambitions. The Golden Cup, once a vessel of potential death, became a symbol of moral and ethical responsibility, reminding rulers and citizens alike that every indulgence carries a weight beyond the immediate. The metaphor extended to all facets of imperial and civic life. Trust, once freely given, became tentative. Alliances required careful calibration. Ceremonial displays of power masked underlying fragilities. The symbolism of the poisoned banquet illuminated the tension between appearance and reality, between abundance and risk, between wealth and vulnerability. It was a quiet, pervasive lesson that beauty and terror, indulgence and decay were inseparably intertwined. In this slow, reflective evolution, the feast itself fades from the historical stage, leaving behind its shadow the knowledge that every act of consumption, every display of power, and every interaction carries moral significance. Poison, whether literal or symbolic, remains a measure of consequence, a reminder that opulence without wisdom can be lethal, that ambition without caution can be fatal, and that even the grandest civilizations may collapse quietly under the weight of their own indulgence. Thus, the final chapters of the imperial banquet tell a story not of gluttony or murder alone, but of civilization itself, its peaks of beauty, its depth of sophistication, and the subtle, persistent threats that accompany every pursuit of power. The poisoned cup endures as a metaphor, a timeless reflection on human nature, reminding all who read, observe, or imagine that the most dangerous elements are not always visible, and that the slow erosion of trust can be as fatal as any tangible toxin. Even as the tangible grandeur of Rome, Byzantium, and Renaissance courts receded into the dust of history, their banquets persisted, not in marble halls or gilded dining rooms, but in memory, in scholarship, and in the subtle reverberations of culture. Historians, writers, and curious observers centuries later find themselves, in imagination or study, at the long, empty table of emperors and nobles, where the shadows of lavish feasts linger, and the echo of fear still vibrates in the polished floors. The poisoned cups, the gilded plates, the exotic spices, and the silver spoons, whether instruments of real treachery or symbols of human caution, become focal points for reflection on ambition, indulgence, and the human condition. In this reflective space, the distinction between fact and rumor softens. Accounts of Livia Drusilla's alleged poisons, Claudius's fatal mushrooms, and Nero's grotesque spectacles exist in the historical record, alongside speculation, moral commentary, and the interpretive lens of later historians. Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio, and Cassius Dio provide detailed narratives of emperors, courtiers, and conspiracies, yet the subtlety of human motivation often remains obscured. Were these tales of poison literal acts of malice, or were they symbolic representations of the anxieties, rivalries, and vulnerabilities inherent in absolute power? The historian sits at this table, aware that every recorded act of consumption, every morsel, every sip, carries layered meanings, and that the fear it induced may have been as influential as the toxins themselves. The empty table itself becomes a meditation on empire. It stretches across centuries, uniting eras separated by time, yet connected through ritual, psychology, and the cultural imprint of indulgence and suspicion. Marble columns and vaulted ceilings have crumbled, tapestries have faded, golden cups and silver spoons have long since been melted down or lost. Yet the patterns of behavior, the narratives of caution and intrigue, endure. Every act of governance, every negotiation, every exercise of influence is quietly measured against the archetype of the imperial feast, where the very act of eating could determine life, death, or succession. Memory, scholarship, and imagination together preserve the sensory dimensions of these banquets. The historian might envision the flicker of lamp oil on polished stone, the faint perfume of exotic incense mingling with roasted meats, the soft clinking of silver cutlery, and the distant hum of whispered counsel. Perhaps a taster sips first from a wine goblet, an antidote hidden in herbs, or a glance exchanged across the table conveys subtle warning. Every detail, though reconstructed from texts and archaeological evidence, evokes a world in which opulence and peril were inseparable. The act of dining becomes a lens through which we understand social hierarchy, human psychology, and the intertwining of indulgence with vigilance. Poison, whether literal or symbolic, remains central to this reflection. In the historical imagination, it represents both the potential for destruction and the broader moral lessons of caution, restraint, and awareness of human ambition. The cups and platters that once delivered morsels and elixirs now deliver insight. Historians consider how fear shaped behavior, how wealth and power magnified vulnerability, and how the rituals of consumption mirrored the structures of authority and the fragility of trust. The poisoned banquet becomes a mirror in which the human mind observes itself, contemplating both capacity for cruelty and instinct for survival. The meditation also stretches across geography and culture. Rome's influence, transmitted through Byzantium and Renaissance courts, extends into later European traditions of ceremony, etiquette, and courtly performance. Venetian diplomats, Florentine merchants, and French nobles all adapted the rituals and anxieties of their Roman and Byzantine predecessors, creating a continuous thread of cultural memory in which dining was never purely pleasure, but always intertwined with risk. The historian's task is to trace this thread, to imagine the flavors, the fragrances, and the tensions of vanished halls, and to reflect on the enduring human fascination with danger cloaked in beauty. As the historian leans back from this imagined table, the lessons of centuries resonate. The poisoned goblet, the silver spoon, the exotic spice, and the delicate choreography of service are simultaneously practical and symbolic, a testament to the inseparable nature of indulgence and caution. The act of remembrance, the meticulous study of texts, and the reconstruction of sensory experience allow modern observers to participate in the ancient dance of power and vulnerability. The empire, though fallen, continues to speak through these echoes, inviting reflection on the nature of authority, mortality, and human ambition. In the quiet conclusion, the lamps of memory begin to dim. The marble halls dissolve into shadow, the tapestries fade, the echo of music and conversation dwindles. Yet the empire does not vanish entirely. It dreams, preserved in scholarship, narrative, and cultural memory. The historian, seated at the empty table, contemplates the intertwined legacies of power, opulence, and fear, and recognizes that the story of the poisoned banquet is less about the exact substances used than about the enduring reflections it provokes on trust, ambition, morality, and the subtle vulnerabilities that accompany every exercise of authority. And so, the empire sleeps. Its long table, once crowded with emperors, courtiers, tasters, and spies, remains empty, yet infinitely resonant. The lamps go out, but the lessons endure. Poison, in its literal and metaphorical forms, fades into memory, leaving behind the enduring architecture of human behavior and civilization itself. Centuries later, those who study these histories find themselves participants in the eternal banquet, not as diners of flesh and wine, but as observers, reflecting on the impermanence of power, the persistence of fear, and the quiet haunting allure of history itself.